When Roman authority ended in Britain, it did not do so with a single battle, decree, or dramatic farewell. There was no clear moment when Roman Britain ceased to exist. Instead, the end came gradually, unevenly, and often quietly, as institutions weakened and imperial support faded from the island at the edge of the empire. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been governed as a province of the Roman Empire. Roman law structured civic life. Roman taxes funded roads, walls, and garrisons. Roman coinage enabled trade, and Roman authority provided a sense, sometimes fragile, of order. By the early 5th century, however, that system was under growing strain. The empire itself was no longer stable. Civil wars, economic inflation, and external pressures along the Rhine and Danube forced Roman leaders to make difficult choices about where limited military resources should be deployed. Britain, distant and expensive to defend, increasingly appeared expendable. Roman soldiers had been withdrawn from Britain before. Garrisons shifted as threats changed elsewhere. But around the year 410 CE, imperial involvement effectively ceased. The administrative framework that connected Britain to the wider Roman world began to unravel. This did not mean that Roman life immediately vanished. Villas were still occupied. Town councils continued to meet. People still spoke Latin, followed Roman customs, and repaired old buildings using familiar techniques. Yet, without imperial funding and professional troops, maintenance became increasingly difficult. The Roman road network, once carefully maintained by state labor, slowly deteriorated. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Stonework crumbled without replacement. Over time, travel became slower and more dangerous, further isolating communities from one another. One of the most visible symbols of Roman power in Britain was Hadrian's Wall, a massive frontier system stretching across the northern landscape. Built to regulate movement and project authority, the wall required constant upkeep and a steady supply of soldiers. As imperial support declined, forts along the wall were abandoned or repurposed by local groups, no longer functioning as part of a unified defensive system. In towns, the effects were equally profound. Roman urban life depended on taxation and centralized administration. When tax collection faltered, public services declined. Bathhouses closed. Forums fell into disuse. Coins became scarce, forcing communities to rely increasingly on barter and local production. The Roman economy in Britain had been deeply interconnected with continental Europe. Goods such as wine, oil, and fine pottery arrived regularly from Gaul and beyond. As trade routes weakened, imported goods disappeared from archaeological layers. Everyday life became simpler, more local, and more uncertain. For ordinary people, the end of Roman rule was not an abstract political event. It was felt in small, cumulative losses, repairs that were postponed, soldiers who never arrived, markets that no longer functioned as they once had. Authority shifted away from distant emperors toward local leaders who could offer immediate protection. These local leaders were not kings in the later medieval sense. They were landowners, former officials, or military figures who commanded loyalty through personal relationships rather than institutional power. Britain fragmented into regions governed by necessity rather than design. Over time, new cultural influences emerged. Germanic-speaking groups, later known as Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, began settling in parts of eastern and southern Britain. Their arrival was not a single invasion, but a gradual process involving migration, negotiation, and conflict. Romanized Britons and newcomers coexisted in complex ways that archaeology only partially reveals. What vanished most completely was the Roman state itself. Law codes were no longer enforced uniformly. Coinage ceased to circulate. Written records became rare. Britain entered a period where continuity existed, but memory faded. Yet Roman Britain did not simply disappear. Elements of Roman life persisted in building techniques, land boundaries, and social habits. Even centuries later, early medieval rulers would claim legitimacy by invoking Rome, demonstrating how deeply the empire's shadow lingered. The end of Roman Britain was not a dramatic fall, but a long unwinding. It serves as a reminder that civilizations often end not with catastrophe, but with quiet abandonment, as systems become too costly to sustain and too distant to maintain. And in that silence between empire and kingdom, Britain was reshaped. As Roman authority receded, the experience of time itself began to change for the people of Britain. Under imperial rule, life had been structured by predictable rhythms, tax cycles, military rotations, market days, and legal calendars. With the disappearance of centralized administration, these rhythms became irregular or vanished altogether. Communities adapted as best they could, relying on memory, tradition, and local custom rather than written law. Archaeological evidence from the 5th century shows a marked decline in literacy. Inscriptions, once common on stone and metal, became rare. Writing materials were no longer imported in large quantities, and formal education faded outside a small elite. This loss did not indicate intellectual decline, but rather a shift in what knowledge was considered necessary for survival. Practical skills replaced bureaucratic ones. Religious life also underwent a transformation. Christianity had been present in Britain since at least the 3rd century, supported by imperial structures and bishops connected to the wider Roman world. After withdrawal, these connections weakened. Some Christian communities endured, adapting their practices to local conditions, while others blended older traditions with newer beliefs. The religious landscape became more fragmented, reflecting the broader political reality. Rural life proved more resilient than urban life. While towns struggled without state funding, countryside settlements often continued with fewer disruptions. Farms that had once supplied Roman markets turned inward, producing primarily for local consumption. Large villas were sometimes subdivided, repurposed, or abandoned altogether, signaling a shift away from elite Roman lifestyles. Security became a central concern. Without professional Roman troops, communities relied on local defense arrangements. Hill forts, some dating back to the Iron Age, were reoccupied in certain regions. These were not symbols of a return to the past, but practical responses to uncertainty. Defense was no longer an imperial guarantee, but a local responsibility. The political fragmentation of Britain did not occur uniformly. Some regions maintained stronger continuity with Roman traditions, particularly in the West. Elsewhere, new power structures emerged more rapidly. This unevenness is one of the defining features of post-Roman Britain, making it difficult to describe the period as a single narrative. Trade networks shrank but did not disappear. Coastal communities continued limited exchange with continental Europe, particularly with nearby regions across the Channel. These connections were smaller in scale and less regulated, but they provided access to goods, ideas, and people. Britain was not isolated, but it was no longer integrated into a vast imperial economy. Over generations, memory of Roman governance became legend rather than lived experience. Later writers would describe the Roman period as a time of order and prosperity, contrasting it with the uncertainty that followed. Such accounts reflect not only historical change, but also the human tendency to idealize the past when facing instability. The transformation of Britain after Roman withdrawal challenges modern assumptions about collapse. There was no single point of failure, no decisive end date. Instead, the Roman world in Britain slowly dissolved, replaced by something smaller. By the late 5th and early 6th centuries, the world that had once been recognizably Roman had become increasingly distant. For those living in Britain at this time, Rome was no longer a functioning authority but a remembered idea, an inherited memory passed down through stories, ruins, and habits whose original meanings were slowly being forgotten. Children grew up among the remains of stone buildings they could no longer fully explain. Roads still cut through the countryside, but few remembered who had built them or why they ran so straight. Broken columns and roof tiles were reused as ordinary building material, valued not for their origin, but for their usefulness. Rome became part of the landscape rather than the government. Political power in post-Roman Britain rested increasingly on personal loyalty. Leaders offered protection, food, and land in exchange for service. This was not yet feudalism, but it represented a clear departure from Roman bureaucratic governance. Authority was negotiated face to face, enforced by reputation rather than law, and sustained by kinship networks. Violence during this period was real, but it was not constant or universal. Archaeology shows signs of conflict: burned layers, weapon burials, fortified settlements, but also long stretches of continuity. Many communities lived quietly, farming, repairing what they could, and adapting to a world with fewer guarantees. One of the most significant long-term consequences of Roman withdrawal was linguistic change. Latin, once the language of administration and trade, gradually disappeared from everyday use. In its place, regional languages and dialects developed. This shift did not happen overnight. For generations, people likely spoke a mixture of languages, reflecting the layered identities of the island. The absence of written records from this era has often led it to be described as a dark age. But this term reveals more about later historians than about the people themselves. Life continued, families endured, and societies evolved. What changed was visibility. Without centralized record-keeping, history became harder to trace. Material culture provides some of the clearest evidence of adaptation. Pottery styles changed, becoming simpler and locally produced. Jewelry and tools reflected new aesthetic preferences and practical needs. These were not signs of regression, but of transformation under constrained conditions. Roman concepts of citizenship and public duty faded, replaced by more immediate concerns of survival and belonging. Identity became local. A person was defined by their household, their community, and their leader rather than by a distant imperial system. This localization shaped the political geography of Britain for centuries. The environment itself responded to human change. As urban centers declined, forests reclaimed abandoned spaces. Agricultural land shifted in use. Pollen records suggest changes in farming intensity, reflecting population movement and altered economic priorities. Nature filled the gaps left by retreating empire. Despite the disappearance of imperial structures, Roman influence never truly vanished. Later rulers would seek legitimacy by associating themselves with Rome, even if they no longer understood it fully. Roman ruins became symbols of ancient authority, admired and repurposed by those who followed. In the centuries that came after, Britain would again connect to wider worlds through Christianity, trade, and conquest. But these new connections were built upon a transformed society, shaped by the long aftermath of Roman withdrawal rather than by Rome itself. The story of Roman Britain's end is not one of sudden collapse, but of endurance through uncertainty. It reveals how societies respond when large systems fail, how people adapt when institutions disappear, and how the past continues to influence the future long after its power has faded. This slow transition, largely invisible to history, as the 6th century progressed, the distance between Roman Britain and its imperial past widened further. The physical remnants of Roman life remained scattered across the landscape, but their original functions were increasingly misunderstood. A bath complex might be remembered as a place of gathering without knowledge of its engineering. A fortified town wall might be seen as an ancient refuge, not as part of a coordinated urban system. Meaning shifted as memory faded. Leadership during this period became more fluid. Power was rarely absolute and often contested. Small-scale rulers governed limited territories, their authority dependent on personal relationships and the ability to provide security. These leaders were constrained by geography, resources, and the loyalty of followers who could leave if conditions worsened. Stability, when it existed, was fragile. The economy continued to operate at a local level. Long-distance trade, once a defining feature of Roman Britain, had largely disappeared except in isolated coastal zones. Inland communities relied on nearby resources, seasonal labor, and shared obligations. Wealth was measured less by coin and more by livestock, land, and human loyalty. Craft production adapted to this reality. Instead of standardized Roman goods, objects were handmade and varied in style. This variability reflects local identity rather than disorder. Communities produced what they needed, using available materials and inherited skills. Artistry did not vanish. It changed its form and purpose. Burial practices offer insight into shifting beliefs. Roman cemeteries with orderly rows gave way to diverse burial customs, sometimes reflecting new cultural influences, sometimes older traditions resurfacing. These practices reveal how communities understood death, memory, and belonging in a world no longer anchored by empire. The landscape itself became a record of transition. Roads fell out of alignment with daily movement, but they were still used where practical. Fields were reorganized. Boundaries shifted. The countryside bore the marks of continuity and change layered over generations. Oral tradition became increasingly important. Without widespread literacy, knowledge was preserved through storytelling, song, and ritual. History was remembered selectively, shaped by present needs rather than factual precision. Rome survived in these stories not as a political system, but as a distant golden age or a cautionary tale. The absence of centralized authority also meant that innovation occurred unevenly. Some regions experimented with new forms of governance and alliance, while others remained relatively static. This diversity defies simple narratives of decline or progress. Post-Roman Britain was not a single society moving in one direction, but many societies adapting independently. Over time, external influences blended with local traditions. New settlers brought languages, customs, and social structures that interacted with existing ones. This interaction was complex, involving cooperation, intermarriage, and conflict. The resulting cultures were neither fully Roman nor entirely new, but something distinct. By the early 7th century, the Roman past had become a foundation rather than a framework. It shaped the physical and cultural environment without directing it. Britain had moved beyond Rome, even as it continued to live among its remains. This long aftermath underscores, by the time written sources reappear in greater numbers, the world they describe is already far removed from Roman Britain. What survives of the Roman period exists mostly in fragments, place names, reused stone, faint memories embedded in legend. The transition had been so gradual that no generation experienced it as a single rupture. Each generation inherited a slightly altered world and adapted without fully recognizing the scale of change. This gradualism is one of the reasons Roman Britain is so difficult to reconstruct. Archaeology offers objects, structures, and environmental data, but rarely clear explanations. A reused Roman building might indicate continuity, necessity, or reverence. A sudden absence of coinage might reflect economic collapse, or simply a shift toward non-monetary exchange. Interpretation requires restraint because certainty is rare. One of the most enduring Roman legacies was spatial organization. Even after urban life declined, former Roman towns often remained focal points. They attracted markets, religious activity, and later political authority. The Roman decision of where to place roads, forts, and settlements continued to shape movement and power long after Roman governance had ended. The social hierarchy of Roman Britain also left traces. Although formal ranks disappeared, distinctions between elites and non-elites remained. Those with access to land, followers, or inherited authority were better positioned to navigate uncertainty. Inequality did not vanish with empire. It simply took new forms. Roman law as a written system faded quickly, yet legal concepts such as compensation, obligation, and authority persisted in customary practices. Disputes were resolved locally, often through negotiation rather than centralized judgment. Justice became personal and situational, shaped by relationships rather than statutes. The military transformation was equally significant. Roman Britain had relied on a standing army paid and supplied by the state. After withdrawal, military power became temporary and decentralized. Armed groups formed when needed and disbanded when resources ran out. Warfare was smaller in scale but more unpredictable, driven by local disputes rather than imperial strategy. The psychological impact of living among ruins should not be underestimated. Monumental Roman architecture dwarfed the buildings that replaced it. For later communities, as Britain moved further away from the Roman centuries, the meaning of authority itself continued to evolve. Power was no longer associated with distant institutions, written orders, or uniform systems. Instead, it became embedded in people and places that could be seen and reached. A leader's legitimacy depended less on inherited titles and more on their ability to provide protection, resolve disputes, and distribute resources in a fragile environment. This shift reshaped social expectations. Under Roman rule, individuals had been subjects of a state. Afterward, they became members of households and communities whose survival depended on cooperation. Loyalty was personal and conditional. If a leader failed, followers could leave. This fluidity made power unstable, but it also prevented absolute domination. Authority had to be continually earned. The disappearance of Roman taxation was particularly transformative. Taxes had linked individuals to the empire, compelling participation in a system larger than the local community. Without them, economic obligations became negotiated rather than enforced. Exchange relied on trust, reciprocity, and reputation. Debt and obligation existed, but they were embedded in social relationships rather than recorded in accounts. Land ownership also changed in character. Roman legal frameworks defining property boundaries and inheritance faded, replaced by customary arrangements shaped by local consensus. Land was valuable not as a commodity to be taxed, but as a source of sustenance and status. Control over land conferred influence, but only as long as it could be defended. In this context, violence functioned differently than it had under Roman rule. The Roman army had monopolized legitimate force, enforcing order through discipline and deterrence. After its withdrawal, force became decentralized. Violence was episodic rather than systematic, arising from disputes over land, resources, or loyalty. It was often restrained by the knowledge that prolonged conflict weakened everyone involved. Women's roles during this period are difficult to trace, but they were likely significant in maintaining continuity. Household management, agricultural labor, and the transmission of cultural knowledge fell largely within domestic spheres. In the absence of formal institutions, families became the primary units of stability, and women were central to their functioning. Children grew up in a world without formal schooling, but not without education. Skills were taught through observation and participation. Knowledge was practical, immediate, and cumulative. Farming techniques, craftsmanship, and social norms were learned through daily life rather than instruction manuals or written law. The Roman calendar, once a unifying framework, lost its authority. Time became seasonal rather than administrative. Agricultural cycles, religious observances, and local events structured the year. This change altered how people understood continuity and planning. The future was measured in harvests rather than imperial reigns. Memory played a critical role in preserving identity. Genealogies, stories of ancestors, and local legends provided a sense of belonging in a world without centralized records. These narratives were selective, emphasizing continuity and legitimacy. Rome entered these memories not as a precise historical reality, but as a distant source of authority and order. The physical environment reinforced this layered memory. Roman ruins stood alongside newer structures, creating a visible contrast between past and present. These remains may have inspired both awe and practicality. Stone was quarried from old buildings. Walls became boundaries. Roads guided movement even as their original purpose was forgotten. Over time, these ruins lost their association with Roman power and acquired new meanings. They became landmarks, gathering places, or symbols of antiquity. In some cases, they were imbued with supernatural explanations, reflecting attempts to account for structures that exceeded contemporary capabilities. This reinterpretation of the past reveals a broader pattern in human history. When institutional memory fades, material remnants become prompts for imagination. The Roman Empire survived not as a functioning system, but as a conceptual presence, an idea of greatness that could be admired, feared, or claimed. As centuries passed, new religious and political frameworks emerged that offered fresh forms of cohesion. Christianity, in particular, provided a translocal identity that connected Britain to a wider world once again. Unlike Roman administration, religious networks relied on shared belief rather than centralized enforcement. They offered meaning and structure without requiring imperial infrastructure. The return of as the centuries unfolded, the cumulative effects of these adaptations became increasingly visible in the structure of society. What had begun as improvised responses to imperial absence slowly solidified into norms. Practices that were once temporary became customary, and what had been solutions born of necessity evolved into traditions accepted as natural. One of the most profound changes was the way communities understood belonging. Under Roman rule, identity had been layered: local, provincial, imperial. After withdrawal, these layers collapsed inward. Belonging was rooted in proximity, who lived nearby, who shared resources, who offered protection. Community boundaries were defined less by formal borders and more by shared experience and mutual obligation. This localization affected conflict as well. Disputes were rarely abstract or ideological. They were personal, tied to land use, inheritance, or broken agreements. Resolution depended on negotiation, mediation, or limited violence, rather than appeals to a distant authority. The goal was often restoration rather than punishment, because ongoing cooperation was essential for survival. Economic life remained constrained by limited surplus. Without imperial redistribution, communities could not rely on external support during hardship. This vulnerability encouraged cautious management of resources and reinforced social bonds. Hoarding was risky. Sharing created obligations that could be called upon later. Economic behavior was embedded in social relationships rather than separated from them. Over time, this fostered a culture in which reputation mattered deeply. Trustworthiness, generosity, and reliability became valuable social currencies. A person's standing was shaped by how they behaved during scarcity as much as abundance. Memory, both individual and collective, acted as a form of informal record-keeping. The material simplicity of this period should not be mistaken for cultural stagnation. Creativity persisted, expressed through oral poetry, music, and craftsmanship. Artistic expression adapted to available materials and audiences. It was intimate rather than monumental, designed to be shared within small groups rather than displayed to distant observers. The rhythms of daily life were closely tied to the environment. Seasonal changes dictated labor patterns, social gatherings, and ritual observances. Knowledge of weather, soil, and animal behavior was essential. This environmental attunement represented a different kind of sophistication, one grounded in observation and experience rather than engineering. As generations passed, the Roman past receded further into abstraction. Children learned of it not through instruction, but through implication. The shape of fields, the straightness of roads, the presence of ruins whose origins were unexplained. Rome became part of the background of life, influencing it without commanding attention. This gradual fading complicates modern efforts to define when Roman Britain truly ended. There is no clear line to draw. Instead, there is a long gradient of change, uneven across regions and social groups. Some areas retained Roman practices longer, others transformed more quickly. The island's diversity defies uniform timelines. What eventually emerged was not a successor to Roman Britain, but a mosaic of societies shaped by shared constraints rather than shared governance. These societies were capable of growth, conflict, and renewal. They laid the foundations for later political structures, languages, and identities that would define Britain in the medieval period and beyond. The study of this transition challenges the notion that complexity depends on scale. Roman Britain was complex because it was integrated into a vast empire. Post-Roman Britain was complex because it was fragmented, adaptive, and relational. Complexity took a different form, one less visible in records but no less real. In examining this period, modern observers must resist the urge to impose narratives of decline or rebirth. The people who lived through these centuries were not experiencing an ending or a beginning. They were responding to immediate realities, making choices that made sense within their circumstances. The withdrawal of Rome removed a framework, but it did not erase human agency. On the contrary, it amplified it. Without centralized direction, Individuals and communities bore greater responsibility for shaping their futures. This responsibility was unevenly distributed and often burdensome, but it fostered resilience. In the end, Roman Britain serves as a case study in historical continuity amid institutional failure. It shows how societies can persist without the structures that once defined them, how memory and material culture interact, and how adaptation unfolds over time rather than in moments. The empire's absence was not filled by chaos, but by quiet reorganization. Life narrowed in scope but deepened in connection. Authority became personal, economy became social, and history became local. This long, subtle transformation reminds us that the most significant changes in history are often the least dramatic. They occur not through conquest or proclamation, but through everyday decisions repeated across generations. Roman Britain did not vanish into darkness. It dissolved into the lives of the people who remained, leaving behind a legacy measured not in monuments or law. As attention shifts from structures to lived experience, it becomes clear that the long aftermath of Roman withdrawal reshaped how people understood continuity itself. Without an empire to define eras or mark progress, time lost its grand narrative. Change was measured in personal terms, by the aging of elders, the succession of children, the endurance of fields and homes. History, in the sense of a shared chronological record, gave way to memory grounded in place. This localized sense of time altered how the past was valued. Roman authority, once immediate and practical, became symbolic. Its remnants were not preserved for historical reasons, but because they remained useful or meaningful. A Roman milestone might still mark a boundary. A ruined fort might still offer shelter. The past survived insofar as it served the present. The concept of public space also changed. Roman towns had been designed for civic life. Forums, basilicas, bathhouses. Spaces meant to bring strangers together under a shared identity. After Rome, communal life retreated into smaller settings. Halls, farms, local gathering points. Interaction was no longer anonymous or universal. It was personal and repeated. This shift affected social cohesion. In the absence of large institutions, cohesion depended on shared norms enforced through social pressure rather than law. Reputation mattered. Exclusion was a powerful sanction. These mechanisms could be harsh, but they were also flexible, allowing communities to adapt rules to circumstance. Food production and distribution reveal another dimension of adjustment. Roman Britain had relied on surplus extraction to support towns and troops. Post-Roman Britain relied on subsistence and limited exchange. Farming became more diversified, reducing dependence on single crops. Risk was spread across households and seasons. This approach favored stability over expansion. Environmental evidence suggests that landscapes once shaped by intensive Roman agriculture became more varied. Pasture expanded in some regions, woodland reclaimed others. These changes were not uniform declines but rebalancing acts between human labor and ecological limits. The land adjusted alongside the people. The absence of imperial oversight also allowed for cultural blending. Without rigid administrative categories, identities became porous. Practices associated with Roman, indigenous, and newcomer traditions intermingled. Cultural boundaries were negotiated rather than imposed, producing hybrid forms visible in material culture and social custom. These hybrids challenge modern labels. Terms like Roman or post-Roman oversimplify realities that were fluid and overlapping. Individuals did not abandon one identity for another. They accumulated influences, adapting them to local needs. Identity was situational, shaped by context rather than doctrine. Leadership during this time required constant engagement. Unlike Roman officials, local leaders could not rely on institutional backing. Their authority depended on consensus and performance. They mediated disputes, organized defense, and redistributed resources. Failure carried immediate consequences, limiting the concentration of power. This limitation fostered a political culture that valued pragmatism. Decisions were judged by outcomes rather than ideology. Alliances were temporary, formed to address specific needs. While this made long-term planning difficult, it allowed rapid adjustment to changing conditions. The emotional landscape of this period is difficult to reconstruct, but uncertainty was likely a constant presence. Without guarantees, people relied on relationships and routines. Stability came from familiarity rather than predictability. Life was narrower in scope but potentially richer in connection. As centuries passed, some communities achieved relative stability, developing enduring local traditions. Others remained more transient, responding to shifting pressures. This unevenness produced a patchwork of experiences rather than a unified historical trajectory. When later chroniclers looked back, they interpreted this era through their own frameworks, often emphasizing loss or moral decline. Such interpretations reflect the values of those writing rather than the realities of those living through the transition. The absence of empire was not universally experienced as catastrophe. Instead, it was a process of recalibration. People learned to live without distant authority, to solve problems locally, and to transmit knowledge without formal systems. These adaptations were not signs of failure but of resilience under constraint. The long-term effects of this period extended far beyond Britain. Similar processes unfolded across former Roman territories, each shaped by local conditions. Britain's experience illustrates a broader pattern. The endurance of society after empire depends less on preserving structures than on sustaining relationships. In this light, the end of Roman Britain offers insight into how societies absorb systemic change. It reveals the importance of flexibility, the role of memory, and the capacity of ordinary people to reconstruct meaning when established frameworks dissolve. The Roman Empire provided order, scale, and connectivity. Its absence forced a different equilibrium, smaller, slower, and more personal. Neither state was inherently superior. Each responded to its circumstances. By tracing this long transition, we gain a clearer understanding of history not as a sequence of rises and falls, but as a continuum of adaptation. Roman Britain did not collapse into chaos nor evolve seamlessly into medieval order. It passed through a long, quiet transformation shaped by countless individual choices. These choices, largely unrecorded, formed the foundation of later societies. They determined how power was exercised, how resources were shared, and how the past was remembered. Their significance lies not in dramatic events, but in endurance. In the end, the story of Roman Britain after Rome is a study. As the transition extended into later centuries, the accumulated weight of these local adaptations began to shape enduring patterns of social organization. What had once been provisional responses to uncertainty hardened into expectations. Children born into this world knew nothing of Roman administration as a lived reality. For them, the absence of empire was not a loss but a given. Their understanding of order, authority, and obligation was formed entirely within a post-Roman context. This generational shift is crucial. The first generation after withdrawal still remembered Roman officials, soldiers, and institutions. The second remembered only stories. By the third, Rome existed as a distant and abstract reference, detached from practical life. With each passing generation, the Roman framework lost explanatory power, replaced by local logics that better accounted for daily experience. Social memory adapted accordingly. Stories of the past were streamlined, focusing on moral lessons rather than factual detail. Events were remembered for what they explained or justified in the present. Rome became a symbol of an earlier order, sometimes idealized, sometimes blamed, but rarely examined in concrete terms. Its role was interpretive rather than instructional. This symbolic Rome served multiple functions. For emerging elites, it offered a source of legitimacy. Claiming continuity with Roman authority, even vaguely, helped distinguish leaders from rivals. For communities, it provided a sense of deep time, a reminder that the landscape had known other orders before the current one. Memory thus became a political resource shaped by present needs. Material inheritance reinforced this selective remembrance. Roman artifacts circulated without their original context. Coins might be worn as ornaments. Stone inscriptions might be reused face down. These objects carried authority without explanation. Their power derived from age and mystery rather than meaning. The process by which Roman Britain faded also reshaped how people responded to change itself. Without a centralized state to manage transitions, communities developed a tolerance for gradual instability. Change was expected, managed incrementally, and absorbed into routine. This adaptability reduced the shock of disruption but also limited the capacity for large-scale coordination. The absence of empire altered the relationship between center and periphery. Under Roman rule, Britain had been a marginal province connected to distant centers of power. After withdrawal, there was no single center. Power was distributed across many small nodes, each with its own priorities. This decentralization limited domination but also fragmentation. Over time, some of these nodes grew more powerful than others, forming the basis of later kingdoms. Their growth was uneven, shaped by geography, resources, and chance. River valleys, fertile plains, and strategic crossings became focal points of authority. Control emerged where coordination was possible, not where it was mandated. The legacy of Roman infrastructure continued to influence these developments. Roads facilitated movement and communication even in disrepair. Former forts offered defensible positions. Towns, though diminished, provided symbolic and logistical advantages. The Roman past thus shaped the geography of power long after its institutions had vanished. Yet this influence was indirect. New rulers did not govern as Roman officials had. They did not administer provinces or collect standardized taxes. Instead, they ruled through personal bonds, ritual display, and negotiated obligations. Authority was visible and immediate, embodied in the presence of the ruler rather than in documents or offices. The cultural consequences of this shift were profound. Art, law, and social norms emphasized relationships over abstractions. Loyalty was demonstrated through action rather than declared through status. Justice was situational, responsive to context rather than precedent. These traits reflected the conditions of a society without centralized enforcement. Religion increasingly provided a counterbalance to fragmentation. Religious communities offered continuity across regions, preserving literacy and shared narratives. Unlike Roman administration, religious authority was portable. It could operate without extensive infrastructure, relying on belief and ritual rather than coercion. This made it well suited to a post-imperial world. The reintroduction of writing through religious channels did not restore historical clarity about the Roman past. Instead, it reframed it. Written accounts emphasized moral interpretation over factual reconstruction. Rome was remembered through lenses shaped by new values, reinforcing its symbolic role while obscuring its practical realities. As a result, later understandings of Roman Britain were shaped less by what Rome had been than by what its absence revealed. The focus shifted from imperial achievement to human endurance. The question was no longer how Rome ruled, but how people lived without it. This perspective highlights a fundamental aspect of historical change. Large systems often attract attention because of their scale and complexity, but their disappearance reveals the underlying capacities of society. When Rome withdrew, it exposed the strength and limits of local organization. What followed was not a vacuum, but a redistribution of responsibility. Individuals and households bore greater burdens. Decisions about production, defense, and cooperation had immediate consequences. Failure was localized but personal. Success was fragile but meaningful. Life demanded constant adjustment, but it also allowed agency where imperial systems had constrained it. The endurance of communities through this period demonstrates that stability does not require uniformity. Order can emerge from diversity, provided there are shared expectations and mechanisms for negotiation. Post-Roman Britain exemplifies this principle, showing how coherence can arise without centralized design. This long transition resists dramatic conclusions. There was no moment when Roman Britain definitively ended and something else began. Instead, there was a gradual reorientation of values, practices, and identities. The Roman world receded as a reference point, replaced by new frameworks grounded in immediacy and locality. By the time later political structures consolidated, the Roman past had become distant enough to be invoked without constraint. Could be admired without being understood, claimed without being replicated. Its authority was cultural rather than institutional. In this sense, the end of Roman Britain was not a failure of continuity but a transformation of it. Continuity persisted in altered form, carried by people rather than systems. The past lived on through adaptation rather than preservation. The quietness of this process is its defining feature. Without proclamations or monuments, change unfolded through daily choices repeated over generations. Fields were planted, disputes settled, alliances formed, and children raised in a world that gradually became something new. The story that emerges is not one of decline into obscurity, but of redefinition. Roman Britain became post-Roman Britain not through collapse, but through the steady accumulation of adjustments that reshape society from the ground up. And in recognizing this, we gain a deeper understanding of how history works, not as a sequence of endings and beginnings, but as an ongoing negotiation between past inheritance and present necessity, carried forward by ordinary lives long after empires have withdrawn. As this redefined world matured, its structures became increasingly self-referential. Authority no longer justified itself by appealing to what had existed before, but by what could be sustained in the present. The Roman past, once a silent framework shaping expectations, now functioned mainly as a distant comparison, something that explained why the present was different, not how it should be organized. This shift marked a subtle but important change in how people understood legitimacy. Under empire, legitimacy flowed downward from a recognized center. After Rome, it flowed outward from successful practice. Leaders were followed because they worked, because they resolved problems, because they maintained stability. When they failed, their authority dissolved quickly. This dynamic produced societies that were cautious, adaptive, and acutely aware of limits. Over time, these limits shaped political imagination. Grand projects became rare. Large-scale coordination was difficult to sustain, and ambition was tempered by experience. Instead of expanding systems, communities focused on maintaining balance between land and labor, obligation and reward, force and restraint. Political culture favored endurance over innovation. This endurance was tested repeatedly. Periodic scarcity, disease, and local conflict disrupted lives without warning. Without imperial buffers, shocks were felt directly. Yet the absence of centralized systems also meant that failure was contained. Collapse did not ripple outward across vast networks. It remained local. Communities could recover without waiting for distant intervention. In this environment, trust became the most valuable resource. Trust determined who received help during hardship, who could claim leadership, and who could be relied upon in conflict. Trust was built slowly and lost quickly. It depended on consistency over time, reinforcing the importance of memory and reputation. Memory itself became an active force. Without written archives, memory was selective and purposeful. It preserved what mattered for cohesion and discarded what did not. This process reshaped the past continually, aligning it with present needs. Roman Britain survived in memory not as a complex administrative system, but as a symbol of lost order or ancestral authority. The landscape reinforced this symbolic memory. Roman roads, walls, and ruins endured precisely because they were durable. Their survival gave the impression of permanence, even as the society that built them had vanished. This contrast between material endurance and institutional disappearance shaped how people understood change. It taught that structures could outlast the systems that created them. This lesson influenced later political thinking. New rulers recognized the power of visible continuity. Building on Roman sites, reusing Roman materials, and associating authority with ancient places lent legitimacy. The past was not preserved faithfully. It was repurposed strategically. Such repurposing did not require accurate knowledge. In fact, distance from the original context made reinterpretation easier. Rome could be whatever the present required it to be, a golden age, a warning, or a source of prestige. Its flexibility as a symbol increased as its reality faded. Meanwhile, everyday life remained grounded in immediate concerns. Agricultural routines, household labor, and local exchange structured existence. These activities rarely entered historical records, yet they sustained society. Their repetition across generations provided continuity more reliable than any institution. Children learned the world not through abstract instruction, but through participation. They absorbed norms by watching adults resolve disputes, manage resources, and respond to uncertainty. Social learning was embedded in practice rather than doctrine. This method was resilient but conservative, favoring proven approaches over experimentation. The result was a society that valued stability over growth. Expansion, whether territorial or economic, carried risks that could not be easily mitigated. Caution became a rational strategy. Innovation occurred slowly, tested incrementally, and often remained localized. This conservatism did not imply stagnation. Change continued, but it followed different pathways. Instead of sweeping reforms, there were gradual adjustments. Instead of uniform systems, there were variations adapted to local conditions. Diversity was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed. As centuries passed, these patterns created a new historical baseline. The memory of empire became increasingly distant, while the practices developed in its absence became tradition. What had once been adaptation hardened into identity. When later political structures expanded again, they did so upon this foundation. Their success depended on integrating local norms rather than replacing them. Authority had to resonate with established expectations shaped during the post-Roman centuries. This long perspective reveals that the most influential period in Britain's transformation was not the height of Roman rule, but the centuries that followed its withdrawal. It was during this time that fundamental assumptions about authority, economy, and community were renegotiated. These renegotiations were not recorded in proclamations or treaties. They occurred through daily decisions: how to share land, whom to trust, how to remember the past. Their cumulative effect reshaped society more profoundly than any single event. The study of Roman Britain's aftermath thus challenges event-centered history. It suggests that endurance, adaptation, and memory are as historically significant as conquest or collapse. It invites attention to the slow processes that operate beneath visible change. In this view, the end of Roman Britain is not a boundary between eras but a prolonged zone of transition. The significance lies in its duration and subtlety. It shows how societies absorb loss, redistribute responsibility, and continue without clear direction. This continuity without central control reveals a fundamental capacity of human communities. When large systems withdraw, people do not simply wait for replacements. They reorganize around what remains: relationships, land, habit, and memory. The Roman Empire provided scale and structure. Its absence revealed resilience and constraint. Together, these conditions shaped the Britain that emerged in the early medieval period and, indirectly, the later societies that followed. The story, when viewed in full, is not one of decline into obscurity but of transformation through persistence. Roman Britain did not end because people failed. It ended because the framework that supported it withdrew. What followed was not emptiness, but reconfiguration. And in that reconfiguration, carried out quietly over generations, lies one of the most instructive episodes in history. A reminder that the passage from one world to another is rarely marked by endings, but by long, patient adjustment to what remains. As the post-Roman centuries accumulated, the memory of empire became increasingly detached from lived experience, yet its influence remained embedded in assumptions about space, authority, and order. Even when people no longer identified themselves in relation to Rome, they continued to inhabit a world shaped by Roman decisions made generations earlier. This quiet inheritance illustrates how deeply infrastructure and habit can outlast political power. One of the most enduring legacies was the idea that order itself was something constructed rather than natural. Roman rule had demonstrated that systems could be imposed, maintained, and then removed. In its absence, communities understood that stability required effort. Order was not assumed. It was produced through negotiation, compromise, and shared expectations. This understanding fostered a cautious realism about governance. The absence of centralized authority also sharpened awareness of interdependence. Survival depended on cooperation within small networks. Households relied on neighbors, leaders relied on followers, and communities relied on shared norms. This web of mutual dependence limited extremes. Excessive coercion or selfishness threatened cohesion and invited retaliation or abandonment. Over time, these dynamics produced a social ethic grounded in reciprocity. Obligations were personal and situational rather than abstract. A person's worth was measured by reliability in times of need. This ethic did not eliminate conflict, but it framed it. Disputes were resolved with an eye toward restoring balance rather than enforcing principle. The Roman past continued to surface in subtle ways. Agricultural boundaries followed old cadastral lines. Paths traced ancient roads even when their origins were forgotten. Place names preserved fragments of Latin vocabulary. These survivals did not require conscious preservation. They endured because they remained useful. This persistence highlights an important distinction between memory and continuity. Memory fades when it is not reinforced, but continuity can persist without awareness. Roman Britain survived less as a remembered polity than as a lived environment. People moved through Roman spaces without recognizing them as such, integrating them into new patterns of life. The gradual disappearance of Roman identity also reveals how identity itself is sustained. It requires institutions, rituals, and reinforcement. When these vanish, identity dissolves not abruptly but through neglect. Roman Britain did not reject Rome. It simply stopped reproducing Roman practices. Identity faded because it was no longer necessary. In contrast, new identities emerged organically. They were not designed but accumulated. Shared experiences of uncertainty, adaptation, and local cooperation created bonds stronger than inherited labels. These identities were flexible, capable of absorbing newcomers and adjusting to change. This flexibility proved essential as external influences continued to arrive. Migration did not cease after Rome. It continued in varied forms. The societies that had developed in the post-Roman period were shaped by this movement. Their decentralized nature allowed for accommodation as well as resistance, depending on circumstance. The long-term consequence was cultural layering rather than replacement. Elements accumulated rather than displaced one another entirely. This layering complicates attempts to define clear cultural boundaries. Britain became a palimpsest of influences, each partially visible beneath the others. Such complexity challenges simplified historical narratives. It resists binary interpretations of continuity versus rupture. Instead, it suggests that history operates through overlapping processes, some fading, some persisting, some re-emerging in altered form. The Roman Empire, once the dominant frame of reference, became one layer among many. Its importance lay not in direct continuity, but in how its absence structured adaptation. The vacuum it left behind shaped behavior more profoundly than its presence ever had. This perspective reframes the concept of collapse. Collapse implies sudden failure and replacement. What occurred in Roman Britain was neither. It was a redistribution of functions, from centralized institutions to local practices. Governance did not disappear, it localized. Economy did not vanish, it simplified. Culture did not die, it transformed. Understanding this redistribution requires attention to scale. Large systems concentrate power and resources, enabling complexity at the cost of dependency. Small systems disperse responsibility, reducing efficiency but increasing resilience. Post-Roman Britain illustrates the trade-offs inherent in this shift. Neither model is inherently superior. Roman Britain achieved remarkable integration and infrastructure, but it depended on conditions that could not be sustained indefinitely. The post-Roman world lacked scale but endured through adaptability. Each responded to its context. As later centuries introduced new forms of organization, they did so by recombining these elements. The slow pace of this process invites patience from modern observers. It resists dramatic storytelling, yet its importance lies precisely in its subtlety. It shows how societies absorb systemic change without collapsing, how continuity persists without institutions, and how the past shapes the future through residue rather than replication. In tracing this long aftermath, one comes to recognize that the Roman Empire's final influence on Britain was not its law, language, or architecture, but the conditions its withdrawal created. Those conditions forced adaptation, localization, and resilience. Roman Britain ended not when the last official departed, but when people no longer organized their lives around imperial expectations. That shift took generations. It was complete only when Rome ceased to matter as a guide for action. What remained was not emptiness, but a reconfigured world. One in which authority was negotiated, economy was social, and identity was local. From this world emerged the foundations of medieval Britain, shaped less by imperial design than by lived adjustment. The story, viewed in full, affirms a central insight of history. Societies are not defined solely by the systems that govern them, but by how people respond when those systems recede. Roman Britain's legacy lies in that response, a long, quiet demonstration of human adaptability in the shadow of a vanished empire. As this reconfigured world continued to evolve, its defining feature remained the absence of any single organizing authority capable of imposing coherence across the whole island. Yet this absence did not produce fragmentation without meaning. Instead, it encouraged a form of order that emerged from repetition, habit, and mutual expectation rather than from command. Over generations, people internalized this way of living. They learned that security was provisional, that alliances were conditional, and that continuity depended on effort rather than entitlement. These lessons shaped behavior in subtle ways. Caution became a virtue. Flexibility was prized. Excess ambition was viewed with suspicion, not because aspiration was unknown, but because experience had shown how easily large designs could fail. This mindset influenced how communities approached leadership. A leader was expected to listen as much as command, to negotiate as much as enforce. Authority that ignored local realities rarely endured. Power, when exercised too rigidly, provoked resistance or withdrawal. In this sense, post-Roman Britain fostered an early understanding of limits, of how much control was possible and at what cost. The legal culture that emerged reflected these limits. Rather than abstract principles applied universally, justice was contextual. Outcomes mattered more than procedures. The goal was to restore social balance, not to affirm institutional authority. Compensation, reconciliation, and negotiated settlement were often preferable to punishment, which risked further instability. This emphasis on balance extended into economic life. Accumulation beyond immediate needs carried social risk. Wealth that was not redistributed invited resentment. Generosity functioned as both moral expectation and practical investment. Giving created obligations that could later be claimed. In this way, economic behavior reinforced social cohesion. The long absence of standardized currency deepened these patterns. Value was measured relationally rather than numerically. Goods, labor, and loyalty circulated within networks of trust. This system limited expansion but strengthened bonds. It also made inequality visible and personal, rather than abstract and distant. As time passed, the memory of Roman governance became increasingly detached from these lived realities. Younger generations could not imagine a world in which distant officials collected taxes or enforced law. The empire, once a tangible presence, became a story, sometimes admired, sometimes resented, often misunderstood. Yet even as its memory faded, Rome's imprint persisted through constraint. The shapes of fields, the routes of travel, and the locations of settlements continued to channel behavior. People acted within environments structured by earlier decisions, even when they no longer recognized their origins. This illustrates how the past can govern without being remembered. Such unrecognized inheritance complicates modern interpretations. It is tempting to draw clear lines between Roman and post-Roman, but the reality is one of overlap. The Roman world did not end. It dissolved into conditions that shaped what followed. Its influence became indirect, embedded in landscape and habit rather than institution. The emergence of new political entities did not reverse this process. Even as authority consolidated in certain regions, it did so by adapting to established norms rather than erasing them. Successful rulers learned to work within local expectations formed during centuries without centralized rule. Their legitimacy depended on continuity with lived experience, not on imitation of Rome. This continuity explains why later states in Britain developed along distinctive lines. They did not replicate Roman administration because the social foundations for it no longer existed. Instead, they combined inherited practices with new forms of organization suited to their context. The result was a political culture shaped as much by absence as by presence. The study of Roman Britain's aftermath thus offers insight into how societies absorb large-scale loss. It shows that the disappearance of institutions does not erase social order, transforms it. Order becomes negotiated rather than imposed, relational rather than formal, adaptive rather than rigid. These qualities, developed over centuries, influenced how later societies responded to new challenges. They shaped attitudes toward authority, law, and community that persisted long after the Roman past had receded into abstraction. In this way, the post-Roman centuries were not merely transitional. They were formative. What makes this history difficult to grasp is its lack of spectacle. There are few decisive moments, few dramatic turning points. Change unfolded through routine. Fields were planted differently. Disputes were settled locally. Children learned new norms without recognizing them as new. History moved quietly, carried by ordinary lives. Yet it is precisely this quietness that gives the period its significance. It reveals how deeply social structures depend on everyday practice. When large systems fail, what remains is not chaos but habit. People rely on what they know, adjust what they must, and transmit what works. Roman Britain's end was therefore not an event but a condition, a long state of adjustment that reshaped society from the ground up. Its legacy is not found in documents or decrees, but in the ways people learned to live without guarantees. In reflecting on this long transformation, one recognizes that the most enduring consequences of empire are often created after it ends. The withdrawal of Roman authority forced Britain to confront the limits of centralized power and the necessity of local resilience. The solutions that emerged were imperfect, uneven, and unplanned, but they endured. And so the story closes not with a conclusion, but with an understanding. Roman Britain did not disappear into silence. It became quieter, smaller, and more local, yet no less human. Its transformation reminds us that history is not only made by empires and institutions, but by the slow, collective adjustments of people adapting to a world that has changed around them. As this understanding settles, the long arc of post-Roman Britain can be seen not as an anomaly, but as an example of a recurring historical pattern. When large systems retreat, they leave behind not emptiness, but responsibility. That responsibility falls unevenly, shaping societies according to who bears it and how it is managed. In Britain, the weight of adjustment rested largely on local communities. Without distant administrators or imperial guarantees, people had to assess risk continuously. Decisions that might once have been routine, where to settle, how much to plant, whom to trust, carried greater consequences. This sharpened judgment and encouraged conservatism, but it also fostered awareness. People became attentive to signals of change, sensitive to imbalance, and cautious in extending obligation. Such attentiveness altered social interaction. Promises were measured carefully. Commitments were negotiated explicitly. Trust was built slowly, often reinforced through repeated cooperation rather than formal agreement. In this environment, social capital mattered more than abstract authority. Relationships were the infrastructure of survival. This reliance on relationships reshaped conflict. Disputes were unavoidable, but their resolution required restraint. Excessive retaliation risked fracturing the very networks on which survival depended. As a result, mechanisms of mediation and compensation gained importance. These mechanisms were informal, but they were effective precisely because they were embedded in shared experience. The absence of empire also influenced how people imagined the future. Long-term planning beyond the immediate horizon became difficult. Uncertainty discouraged grand projections. Instead, people planned incrementally, adjusting expectations to conditions as they emerged. This orientation did not eliminate foresight, but it grounded it in realism. Over time, this realism became cultural. It shaped attitudes toward ambition, authority, and change. Stability was valued not as permanence, but as balance. Progress was measured not by expansion, but by continuity. These values did not prevent development, but they shaped its form. The Roman past, in contrast, represented a world of scale and projection. Its roads, walls, and cities embodied long-term planning imposed from above. When that world receded, its material remains stood as reminders of a different relationship between power and time. They suggested permanence, yet their abandonment demonstrated fragility. This contrast may have influenced how later societies understood power. Monumentality was admired, but also approached with caution. The ruins of Roman Britain showed that even the most imposing structures could outlast the systems that created them. Power, therefore, was not self-justifying. It required maintenance, legitimacy, and relevance. As centuries passed, this lesson filtered into political culture. Authority was tolerated when it aligned with lived reality and resisted when it did not. The memory of Rome's withdrawal lingered not as a grievance, but as a precedent. It demonstrated that no system was eternal and that adaptation was necessary. This awareness did not produce cynicism. Instead, it fostered pragmatism. People understood that systems served needs and could be replaced when they no longer did. This perspective reduced attachment to abstract institutions and increased emphasis on function. The slow transformation of Roman Britain thus contributed to a broader historical understanding of impermanence. It showed that continuity does not require preservation of form, but preservation of function. Roads could crumble as long as paths remained. Laws could vanish as long as norms endured. Authority could shift as long as order was maintained. From this perspective, the post-Roman centuries appear less as a gap in history and more as a period of recalibration. Society adjusted to new constraints, discovered new equilibria, and developed practices suited to a smaller scale. These practices became the groundwork upon which later developments rested. When new structures eventually emerged, they did so not by erasing the post-Roman experience, but by building upon it. They inherited assumptions about local authority, negotiated obligation, and practical legitimacy. Even when scale increased again, these assumptions continued to shape governance. In this way, the end of Roman Britain was not simply a historical episode confined to a particular era. Its effects rippled forward, influencing how power was exercised, how communities were organized, and how change was understood. The absence of empire became a formative presence. The story resists closure because its consequences were ongoing. Roman Britain ended, but the process it initiated continued. Adaptation did not conclude. It became a permanent feature of social life. Each generation inherited not a finished system, but a method for managing uncertainty. This method, grounded in local cooperation, negotiated authority, and flexible identity, proved durable. It allowed society to endure without grand structures and to incorporate new influences without losing coherence. It was not elegant or efficient, but it worked. In reflecting on this long history, one is reminded that stability is not synonymous with stasis. Stability can be dynamic, maintained through continual adjustment rather than fixed design. Roman Britain's transformation exemplifies this dynamic stability, achieved not through control, but through responsiveness. The empire's departure removed a framework, but it also revealed capacities that had been overshadowed by imperial order. Those capacities, adaptation, negotiation, memory, sustained society when formal systems failed. They are less visible in records, but no less real. And so, the legacy of Roman Britain lies not only in what it was, but in what it made possible. Its end created conditions for new forms of life, new ways of organizing society, and new understandings of authority. These developments were quiet, gradual, and uncelebrated, yet they shaped history as surely as conquest or decree. In the end, the story returns to a simple truth. When empires withdraw, people remain. They continue to live, to adapt, and to create meaning from what is left behind. Roman Britain's long transformation is a testament to that enduring human capacity to persist, to adjust, and to carry the past forward not as a blueprint, but as a resource for survival in an altered world. As the narrative draws toward its far horizon, the significance of Roman Britain's transformation becomes clearer precisely because it never announces itself. There is no final chapter written by those who lived through it, no declaration that one world has ended and another has begun. Instead, there is only continuity shaped by adjustment, and adjustment shaped by necessity. What endured most powerfully from the Roman centuries was not administration or ideology, but precedent. Rome had demonstrated that order could be built, expanded, and withdrawn. Its presence showed what coordinated power could achieve. Its absence revealed the costs of dependence on distant systems. Together, these experiences formed a collective understanding that would quietly inform later generations. This understanding did not produce nostalgia in any consistent sense. While later writers might idealize Rome, those living in the post-Roman centuries were more concerned with the present than with mourning the past. Their relationship to Roman Britain was pragmatic. They used what remained and ignored what no longer served. In doing so, they transformed inheritance into utility. Such pragmatism shaped how history itself was transmitted. The past was remembered selectively, not out of ignorance, but out of relevance. Events and figures were preserved insofar as they explained current arrangements or legitimized authority. What could not be integrated into present needs faded from memory. This process underscores a broader truth about historical continuity. Societies do not preserve the past as an archive. They preserve it as a tool. The Roman past survived in Britain because it could be used symbolically, materially, or practically. When it could not, it disappeared without ceremony. The absence of ceremony is itself telling. Great systems often end not with collapse, but with silence. Administrators stop arriving. Payments cease. Repairs go unfinished. Life continues around the gaps. Over time, the gap becomes the norm. This is how Roman Britain ended, not through destruction, but through neglect absorbed into routine. From the perspective of those living centuries later, this process was invisible. They did not see themselves as inhabitants of a post-imperial landscape. They saw only their immediate world, shaped by constraints and possibilities they had inherited. Rome was not an absence to them. It was simply irrelevant. And yet, this irrelevance was the final stage of transformation. When Rome ceased to matter, its role as an organizing principle was complete. Its influence persisted only where it had been absorbed into habit or environment. Everything else had fallen away. This moment, when the past no longer instructs the present, is rare and significant. It marks not the loss of memory, but the end of dependence. Britain had reached a point where it no longer oriented itself around what had been. It responded instead to what was. From that point forward, new systems could emerge without reference to Rome except as distant example. Authority could be justified on its own terms. Identity could be constructed without imperial categories. Society had become self-referential, grounded in lived reality rather than inherited framework. This self-referential order was not static. It continued to evolve, incorporating new influences and responding to new pressures. But its foundations were set during the long centuries after Rome's withdrawal, when adaptation became a way of life rather than a temporary response. In this sense, the end of Roman Britain was not a conclusion but a beginning of a different kind, one without proclamation, without design, and without certainty. It was a beginning shaped by endurance rather than ambition. The story, when followed to its quiet end, offers a corrective to dramatic histories of collapse and rebirth. It reminds us that most change is not witnessed by chroniclers or marked by monuments. It occurs through ordinary persistence, through people adjusting their lives to altered conditions day after day. Roman Britain's legacy, therefore, is not found solely in ruins or texts, but in this process itself. It lies in the demonstration that societies can survive the loss of their largest systems, that meaning can be rebuilt without instruction, and that continuity does not require permanence of form. What remains after empire and after memory is practice. People plant fields, raise families, negotiate disputes, and tell stories. Through these acts, they create order where none is given. That order may be smaller, slower, and less visible, but it is no less real. In the end, Roman Britain did not vanish into history. It dissolved into life. Its structures faded, its institutions withdrew, and its identity softened until it no longer named the world its people inhabited. But in that dissolution, something enduring emerged, a way of living shaped by awareness of impermanence and the necessity of adaptation. This is the quiet lesson of Roman Britain's end. Empires may withdraw, but human continuity persists. History does not stop when systems fail. It changes scale. And within that smaller scale, carried forward by countless unnamed lives, the future is patiently made. Beyond this quiet lesson lies an even deeper implication, one that becomes visible only when the long span of time is allowed to speak for itself. Roman Britain's transformation was not merely a response to loss. It was an education in limits. It taught successive generations what could be relied upon and what could not, what endured and what dissolved when external guarantees disappeared. This education reshaped expectations. People no longer assumed that order would arrive from elsewhere or that authority would be stable across generations. Instead, continuity was understood as something fragile, requiring constant renewal. Traditions persisted not because they were ancient, but because they worked. Customs survived through repetition, not reverence. This practical orientation toward tradition distinguished the post-Roman world from the Roman one. Under empire, tradition was formalized and recorded, protected by institutions that claimed permanence. After empire, tradition survived only if it could be enacted. If a practice could not be maintained in daily life, it faded without protest. Cultural survival became a matter of function rather than prestige. Such a world valued experience over abstraction. Knowledge was trusted when it had been tested, not when it had been inherited. Elders were respected not for their status, but for their accumulated judgment. Authority flowed from demonstrated understanding rather than formal position. This grounded form of knowledge shaped decision-making at every level. The rhythm of life reinforced this grounding. Seasonal cycles imposed regularity without rigidity. They structured labor and expectation while allowing variation. Time was experienced as recurrence rather than progression. The future resembled the past closely enough to be recognizable, yet different enough to require adjustment. This cyclical sense of time further distanced society from imperial thinking. Rome had conceived of history as expansion, consolidation, and continuity under a single order. Post-Roman Britain experienced history as recurrence punctuated by disruption. Stability was not linear. It was negotiated repeatedly. From this perspective, the Roman past appeared increasingly alien. Its confidence in permanence, its reliance on scale, and its assumption of centralized control belonged to a different worldview. The ruins that remained were impressive but distant, reminders of a way of organizing life that no longer aligned with experience. Yet these ruins also served as silent teachers. They demonstrated both achievement and vulnerability. They showed what coordinated effort could build and what it could abandon. This dual lesson fostered ambivalence toward power. Grandeur inspired admiration, but also caution. Over generations, this ambivalence shaped political imagination. Authority was accepted when it aligned with lived reality and resisted when it exceeded it. Legitimacy required proximity, responsiveness, and restraint. Power that could not be seen or felt directly was suspect. This sensibility would persist even as new structures arose. Later rulers, religious leaders, and institutions succeeded only when they acknowledged the lessons of the post-Roman centuries. They learned to negotiate rather than impose, to adapt rather than command. Where they failed, resistance followed. Thus, the centuries after Roman withdrawal were not a void between meaningful eras. They were a formative interval in which assumptions about governance, community, and survival were recalibrated. The effects of this recalibration extended far beyond Britain, echoing patterns seen across former imperial territories. In Britain's case, the island's geography intensified these effects. Distance from continental centers reinforced self-reliance. Limited resources constrained ambition. These conditions magnified the lessons of Rome's absence, embedding them deeply in social practice. What emerges from this long view is a picture of history shaped less by decisive moments than by sustained adaptation. Roman Britain did not collapse into chaos nor transition smoothly into a new order. It entered a prolonged state of adjustment, during which society learned how to function without scale. This learning process was not conscious or unified. It occurred through trial and error, through local success and failure. Practices that stabilized life persisted. Those that did not were abandoned. Over time, this selective process produced a culture attuned to resilience rather than expansion. Such resilience was not glamorous. It did not produce monuments or texts, but it sustained life. It allowed communities to endure uncertainty, absorb newcomers, and respond to change without losing coherence. In recognizing this, one is compelled to rethink what constitutes historical success. Rome's achievements were extraordinary, but they were bounded by the conditions that supported them. The post-Roman world's achievements were quieter, but they were adaptive. Each reveals different strengths and vulnerabilities. The end of Roman Britain thus offers not a cautionary tale about decline, but an instructive example of continuity under constraint. It shows how societies reorganize when large systems recede, how meaning is reconstructed without instruction, and how order emerges from repeated practice rather than imposed design. As the story finally settles into silence, there is no final transformation to mark, no concluding event to record. There is only the accumulation of lives lived under altered conditions, carrying forward fragments of the past without being defined by them. Roman Britain ended when it ceased to be necessary as a reference. What followed was not a void, but a lived world shaped by adjustment, memory, and endurance. Its significance lies precisely in this ordinariness. And in that ordinariness lies history's most enduring truth, that when empires fade, it is not their structures that determine the future, but the capacity of ordinary people to adapt, persist, and quietly build new ways of living from what remains. As this long adjustment continued, its effects became so deeply embedded that they no longer appeared as responses to loss at all. What had once been adaptation hardened into assumption. People acted not as survivors of an imperial withdrawal, but as inhabitants of a world whose limits and possibilities were taken for granted. In this way, the memory of change itself faded, even as its consequences endured. This forgetting was not a failure of awareness. It was a sign that society had stabilized on new terms. When a way of life no longer needs to justify itself against the past, it has become sufficient in its own right. Post-Roman Britain reached this point gradually, without declaration. The Roman world ceased to be the reference point against which life was measured. At this stage, continuity was no longer conscious. It operated beneath awareness, expressed through habit rather than reflection. People followed paths because they were there, observed customs because they worked, and accepted authority because it functioned within familiar bounds. The reasons why these arrangements existed were less important than the fact that they did. This unconscious continuity shaped emotional life as well. Anxiety about loss diminished as expectations adjusted. People no longer anticipated imperial return or feared its absence. Stability, though limited, was normalized. Risk was accepted as part of life rather than as evidence of disorder. The normalization of uncertainty fostered a particular form of resilience. Rather than attempting to eliminate unpredictability, communities learned to absorb it. Flexibility became a default response. Plans were provisional, open to revision as circumstances changed. This adaptability reduced shock when disruptions occurred. Over time, this orientation toward uncertainty influenced cultural expression. Stories emphasized endurance, cleverness, and balance rather than conquest or permanence. Heroes were those who navigated complexity successfully, not those who imposed order through force. These narratives reinforced values aligned with lived experience. The landscape continued to play a silent role in this process. Roman structures weathered and eroded, their forms softened by time. As they blended further into the environment, they lost their visual dominance. Ruins became features rather than focal points. The past receded physically as well as socially. This physical fading paralleled a conceptual one. Rome ceased to function as a warning or an aspiration. It became background. Its presence was no longer felt as absence, and its absence no longer felt as loss. The empire's legacy had been fully absorbed into the conditions of life. At this point, Britain was no longer post-Roman in any meaningful sense. It was simply itself, a society shaped by history but not oriented toward it. The long transition had ended not with resolution, but with irrelevance. Rome mattered no longer because it no longer explained anything essential. Yet the effects of that transition remained active. The habits formed during centuries of adjustment continued to influence social expectations. Authority was still expected to be visible and responsive. Community remained central. Large, distant systems were approached cautiously. These dispositions, forged in the aftermath of empire, persisted even as circumstances changed. This persistence demonstrates how deeply formative periods of adjustment can be. They shape not only institutions, but assumptions about how the world works. Once internalized, these assumptions guide behavior without needing reinforcement. They become culture. In this sense, the end of Roman Britain was not merely a historical phase, but a cultural foundation. It established patterns of thought and practice that outlasted the conditions that created them. Later developments built upon these patterns, whether consciously or not. Such foundations are difficult to trace because they are rarely articulated. They do not appear in laws or proclamations. They are expressed in expectations, what people consider reasonable, acceptable, or possible. These expectations shape response long before conscious choice enters. The long silence of post-Roman Britain thus speaks volumes. It tells of a society that learned to function without spectacle, to organize without design, and to endure without certainty. It reveals the quiet power of adaptation as a historical force. When history is viewed through this lens, the withdrawal of Rome appears less as an ending than as a redistribution of agency. Responsibility shifted downward, outward, and inward. People became more directly accountable for their world, and in doing so, they reshaped it. This redistribution did not produce uniform outcomes. Inequality persisted, hardship remained, but it did produce continuity without command. Life went on, altered but intact, shaped by cumulative decisions rather than imposed order. The Roman Empire once bound Britain into a vast system that extended far beyond the island. Its withdrawal narrowed horizons but deepened engagement. People knew less of the wider world, but more of their immediate one. Meaning was found close at hand. In the end, this narrowing was not purely a loss. It was a trade-off. Scale was exchanged for intimacy, projection for presence, abstraction for practice. What emerged was a society less visible to history, but no less real. Roman Britain's final legacy lies here, not in the moment of withdrawal, nor in the ruins left behind, but in the long, quiet demonstration that societies can survive profound structural change without collapsing into chaos or freezing in time. They do so not by preserving the past intact, but by translating it, breaking it into usable fragments, discarding what no longer fits, and carrying forward what can be lived with. This translation is never complete or conscious. It unfolds through ordinary life, through repetition, adjustment, and forgetting. It is slow, uneven, and largely invisible. Yet it is through this process that history moves forward. And so, the story of Roman Britain ends not with a final image or a closing date, but with a condition, a world reshaped by the absence of empire, sustained by human adaptability, and carried forward by lives that did not know themselves as historical, but which quietly were. As the final traces of conscious transition dissolved, what remained was a society no longer defined by what it had lost, but by how it functioned. This is perhaps the most difficult stage of historical change to recognize, because it leaves so little explicit evidence. When adaptation succeeds, it erases the sense of rupture that gave rise to it. Life resumes its ordinary pace, and the extraordinary circumstances that shaped it become invisible. In this state, continuity is no longer experienced as recovery. There is no memory of restoration, because nothing is perceived as broken. The world is simply as it is. For post-Roman Britain, this meant that the centuries of adjustment had done their work. The imperial framework was no longer missed, because no one remembered what it had enabled or required. At this point, history ceases to be something that happens to people and becomes something they inhabit. Structures, norms, and expectations operate beneath awareness, guiding behavior without drawing attention to themselves. This is the condition of stability, not the absence of change, but the absorption of change into routine. The Roman past, once dominant, now survived only in its most residual forms. A road guided travel. A wall marked a boundary. A name lingered in speech. These survivals were not reminders of empire. They were simply features of the world. Their origins no longer mattered. This loss of origin is not decay. It is completion. When a system's influence can persist without recognition, it has been fully integrated into the environment it shaped. Roman Britain reached this point not through preservation, but through use. What endured did so because it remained relevant, not because it was remembered. In this way, the end of Roman Britain was neither tragedy nor triumph. It was resolution through normalization. The extraordinary became ordinary. The exceptional became habitual. What had once required explanation no longer did. From the perspective of later centuries, this resolution is almost impossible to detect. It leaves no marker, no final transformation to record. It is visible only in retrospect, as a gradual fading of references, a thinning of memory, and a quiet confidence in new ways of living. This is why Roman Britain's end has so often been misunderstood. Historians search for collapse, invasion, or replacement because these are visible processes. But what occurred instead was absorption, of loss into life, of absence into habit. Such processes leave few traces precisely because they succeed. Yet their significance is profound. They show that societies are not defined solely by their institutions, but by their capacity to function without them. They reveal that order can persist without design, that meaning can endure without doctrine, and that continuity can survive without command. Roman Britain's long transformation stands as an example of this capacity. It demonstrates that human communities do not require permanence to endure. They require adaptability, cooperation, and the willingness to redefine normality when circumstances change. This lesson extends beyond Britain, beyond Rome, beyond any single historical moment. It speaks to the broader human condition. Systems rise and fall, frameworks appear and withdraw, but life continues within and beyond them. What matters is not the survival of structures, but the survival of practices that allow people to live together. In the end, the Roman Empire's most lasting influence on Britain was not what it built, but what its absence revealed. It exposed the depth of local resilience, the strength of social bonds, and the capacity for quiet reorganization. Roman Britain did not end with silence because nothing was happening. It ended with silence because everything essential had already changed. And in that silence, unmarked, uncelebrated, and largely unrecorded, history moved forward, carried not by emperors or institutions, but by ordinary lives adapting, enduring, and continuing without knowing that they were completing one of the most significant transformations in Britain's past. What follows that silence is not emptiness, but distance. Distance between cause and effect, between origin and outcome. By the time Roman Britain had fully receded into the background of life, the forces it had set in motion were already shaping futures that no one could have anticipated. The transition no longer belonged to memory, it belonged to structure. At this stage, the Roman past functioned much like a buried foundation. It no longer determined the shape of what stood above it, yet it constrained possibilities. The alignment of settlements, the routes of movement, and the distribution of resources all bore the imprint of decisions made centuries earlier. These constraints were not experienced as limits imposed by Rome, but as the natural contours of the world. This naturalization of inherited structure is one of the clearest indicators that transformation was complete. When people cease to recognize the contingency of their environment, when they no longer ask why things are arranged as they are, history has done its quiet work. The past has become landscape. In such a world, innovation does not begin from first principles. It begins from what already exists. New practices emerge by modifying old ones, not by replacing them entirely. This incrementalism characterized much of Britain's later development. Change was evolutionary rather than revolutionary, shaped by adaptation rather than design. This helps explain why later political and social systems in Britain appeared uneven and layered. They did not emerge from a single founding moment. They accumulated. Each generation added adjustments suited to its circumstances, inheriting both solutions and problems from those before. Continuity was preserved not by intention, but by default. The Roman centuries thus mattered less for what they prescribed than for what they made possible. They provided an initial configuration of land use, connectivity, and settlement that later societies adapted to new purposes. When imperial coherence vanished, this configuration remained as a scaffold for reorganization. Importantly, this scaffold did not dictate outcomes. It enabled a range of possibilities while excluding others. Britain did not return to a pre-Roman state, nor did it recreate Roman administration. It developed along paths conditioned by inheritance and experience, not by blueprint. This conditioning shaped attitudes toward authority in enduring ways. Power was expected to operate within visible limits. Systems that grew too distant or too rigid were regarded with skepticism. This skepticism was not ideological. It was experiential. It reflected generations of living without external guarantees. Such attitudes did not prevent the reemergence of larger structures, but they influenced how those structures were received and modified. Authority had to negotiate its place within established norms of local responsibility and reciprocal obligation. Where it failed to do so, it encountered resistance. The long aftermath of Roman Britain thus contributed to a political culture in which legitimacy depended on alignment with lived reality. Abstract claims carried little weight unless they translated into practical benefit. This pragmatism, forged in the absence of empire, persisted even as new forms of organization arose. Seen in this light, the post-Roman centuries were not merely a bridge between two orders. They were a crucible in which assumptions about power, community, and continuity were tested and reshaped. The outcomes of this process were subtle but far-reaching. What makes this period challenging to narrate is that it lacks clear protagonists and decisive moments. Its agents were countless unnamed individuals making small choices under constraint. Their collective impact, however, was transformative. Through repetition, they established patterns that outlasted any single generation. This is the paradox of historical significance at the everyday level. Actions taken for immediate survival can, over time, redefine societies. The people of post-Roman Britain did not set out to create a new order. They set out to live. In doing so, they changed the terms on which life was organized. The Roman Empire had once offered a comprehensive framework for understanding the world, its authority, its economy, its future. When that framework withdrew, Britain did not replace it with another comprehensive system. It replaced it with practice. Meaning was generated locally, sustained by habit rather than ideology. This shift from system to practice marks the true end of Roman Britain. It is the point at which Rome no longer structured thought, even indirectly. What remained was not anti-Roman, nor consciously post-Roman. It was simply non-Roman, a world oriented around different assumptions. And from that world emerged new trajectories. Languages evolved, polities formed, identities solidified. All of these developments carried traces of the past, but none were governed by it. The Roman inheritance had been fully translated. In historical terms, this translation is more consequential than preservation. Preserved systems eventually fracture when conditions change. Translated systems adapt. Roman Britain did not survive as a system, but it survived as a set of influences reshaped to fit new realities. This is why its end is best understood not as loss, but as transformation without ceremony. The empire departed, life reorganized, meaning adjusted, and history continued not with a clean break, but with a long, quiet shift in how the world was lived and understood. What remains for us, looking back, is not a clear ending to mark, but a deeper appreciation of how societies endure when the frameworks that once defined them fade away. Roman Britain's story does not teach us how empires fall. It teaches us how people go on. And in that lesson, patient, unspectacular, and profoundly human, the long silence after Rome becomes one of the most instructive chapters in history. As that chapter recedes further into the distance, the historian is left not with a conclusion, but with a changed perspective on what endings mean. Roman Britain did not conclude in a way that satisfies the desire for symmetry or resolution. It did not replace one stable order with another. Instead, it revealed how stability itself can be provisional, emergent, and sustained without grand design. The people who lived through these centuries were not conscious participants in a transformation of historical significance. They did not perceive themselves as standing at the end of an empire or at the beginning of something new. Their concerns were immediate: land, kin, weather, security, and survival. Yet it was precisely this focus on the immediate that allowed society to reorganize successfully. Large systems often impose coherence by abstraction. They connect distant places, standardize behavior, and reduce variation. When such systems disappear, variation returns. Local differences reassert themselves. In Britain, this variation was not a flaw but a resource. Different regions adapted differently, experimenting without knowing it with multiple ways of living after empire. Some of these ways endured, others failed. The landscape of post-Roman Britain became a record of these outcomes, visible in settlement patterns, agricultural practices, and social organization. Over time, the more resilient arrangements spread or were imitated, while less stable ones disappeared. Adaptation functioned as a quiet form of selection. This process did not require coordination or foresight. It emerged organically from repeated interaction with constraints. Practices that minimized risk, strengthened cooperation, and allowed recovery after disruption tended to persist. Those that depended on scale, surplus, or external support did not. In this sense, the end of Roman Britain can be understood as a prolonged experiment in social sustainability. Without intending to, communities tested how little structure was necessary to maintain continuity. They discovered that many functions once provided by empire could be replaced, albeit imperfectly, by local mechanisms. The imperfections mattered. Life became harder in many respects. Access to goods diminished. Security was uneven. Opportunities narrowed. Yet these hardships did not prevent continuity. They reshaped expectations. People learned to live with less predictability and fewer guarantees. This adjustment altered the relationship between individuals and society. Under empire, the state mediated many aspects of life. After its withdrawal, mediation became personal. Individuals relied more heavily on family, neighbors, and leaders they could see and influence. This proximity made social relations more intense and more consequential. Such intensity could produce conflict, but it also fostered accountability. Power could not hide behind distance. Failure was visible. Authority that did not deliver tangible benefit lost support quickly. In this environment, legitimacy was practical rather than ideological. The Roman state had offered a vision of order grounded in continuity and scale. Post-Roman Britain offered a different vision, one grounded in responsiveness and limitation. Neither vision was complete. Each addressed different needs and carried different costs. The long transition between them reveals how societies recalibrate when conditions change. It shows that collapse is not the only outcome of systemic withdrawal. Reorganization is possible, though it may be uneven, fragile, and largely invisible. This invisibility poses a challenge to modern interpretation. Historians rely on records, structures, and events. Periods dominated by habit, adaptation, and oral transmission leave fewer traces. Yet their impact can be deeper precisely because it operates at the level of practice. Roman Britain's aftermath belongs to this category. Its significance lies not in what was recorded, but in what was normalized. It shaped how people understood authority, obligation, and continuity long after Rome ceased to matter. The cumulative effect of these understandings influenced later developments in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Political cultures, social expectations, and patterns of settlement all bore the imprint of centuries lived without centralized empire. In tracing this long arc, one comes to appreciate that history is not driven solely by moments of decision or domination. It is also shaped by long periods of accommodation, during which people learn what they can rely on and what they cannot. Roman Britain's end was such a period. It taught resilience through experience rather than instruction. It demonstrated that societies can endure profound change without losing coherence, provided they adapt at the scale of daily life. This endurance was not heroic in the conventional sense. It did not produce legends or monuments, produced continuity, Fields remained cultivated. Communities persisted. Children grew into adults who inherited a world that, though altered, was stable enough to inhabit. In the end, this is the quiet achievement of post-Roman Britain. Not the preservation of empire, nor the creation of a new order by design, but the maintenance of life across uncertainty. The Roman Empire once defined Britain's place in a wider world. Its withdrawal forced Britain to redefine itself inwardly. That redefinition took centuries and left few explicit markers, but it succeeded. What remains for us is not a dramatic ending to remember, but a process to understand. Roman Britain ended not when the last official departed, but when people no longer needed Rome to explain their world. And in recognizing that moment, diffuse, unrecorded, and gradual, we gain a deeper understanding of how history truly moves. Not in sudden turns, but in long, quiet adjustments carried forward by ordinary lives, adapting patiently to a world that has changed around them. Seen from this final distance, the transformation of Roman Britain invites a reconsideration of what historical continuity truly means. Continuity is often imagined as preservation, the survival of institutions, texts, or monuments. Yet the experience of Britain after Rome suggests a different model. Continuity can also exist as competence, the ability of a society to continue functioning when familiar structures no longer apply. This competence is rarely inherited directly. It is learned. It develops through repeated exposure to uncertainty and the necessity of response. In post-Roman Britain, competence was cultivated not by instruction, but by circumstance. People learned how to manage without guarantees, how to rely on relationships rather than rules, and how to sustain cooperation in the absence of enforcement. Such learning reshaped moral expectations. Responsibility became immediate rather than delegated. Failures were not abstract. They affected neighbors, kin, and allies directly. This proximity fostered a moral economy grounded in reciprocity and restraint. Actions carried visible consequences, reinforcing social accountability. This moral economy was not idealistic. It did not eliminate exploitation or injustice. Power imbalances persisted, and vulnerability was unevenly distributed. Yet the scale at which these dynamics operated limited their reach. Harm could be severe, but it was local. Recovery, when it occurred, was also local. The absence of large systems constrained both damage and repair. Over time, this constraint shaped emotional orientation. Hope was tempered. Expectation was moderated. People learned to anticipate disruption without surrendering to despair. This emotional adjustment is difficult to document, but it is central to understanding endurance. It reflects a form of realism forged through experience rather than philosophy. The Roman past, by contrast, represented a different emotional economy. Promised stability through scale and permanence through structure. Its withdrawal forced a reckoning with impermanence. The lessons learned in that reckoning did not disappear when new systems emerged. They lingered as caution. This caution would influence how later generations engaged with authority. Trust was conditional. Allegiance was negotiated. Even when larger political units formed, they were filtered through expectations shaped by centuries of localized responsibility. Centralization was accepted only insofar as it delivered tangible benefit. In this way, the post-Roman centuries contributed to a distinctive balance between acceptance and skepticism toward power. Authority was neither rejected nor revered by default. It was evaluated. This evaluative stance, born of experience rather than theory, became part of cultural inheritance. the absence of written articulation does not diminish its significance. Many of the most influential assumptions in human societies are never written down. They are learned through participation and reinforced through practice. Post-Roman Britain was rich in such learning. This richness challenges narratives that equate literacy with sophistication. While writing declined, social intelligence flourished. People navigated complex networks of obligation, memory, and expectation without formal documentation. This required attentiveness, judgment, and adaptability, skills that do not leave inscriptions. The eventual reemergence of writing did not erase these skills. Instead, it layered new forms of knowledge onto existing practices. Written law, religious texts, and administrative records entered a world already shaped by oral tradition and lived negotiation. The result was synthesis rather than replacement. From this perspective, Roman Britain's end was not a rupture in historical development, but a recalibration of the relationship between structure and agency. Structure receded, agency expanded. People bore more responsibility for maintaining order, and in doing so, they refined the practices that made order possible. This expansion of agency did not mean increased freedom in a modern sense. Constraints were real and often severe, but agency operated at the scale that mattered most: the ability to respond to immediate circumstances and influence local outcomes. In the absence of empire, this capacity became central. As centuries passed, the cumulative effect of countless local responses shaped broader patterns. What began as adaptation hardened into expectation. What began as necessity became norm. Society stabilized not because it returned to a known form, but because it discovered new equilibria. These equilibria were not designed. They emerged. They were shaped by geography, climate, memory, and chance. They were uneven and imperfect, yet they endured long enough to become foundations for later developments. The Roman Empire once connected Britain to a vast, coherent world. Its withdrawal narrowed that world but deepened engagement within it. People knew less of distant affairs, but more of their immediate environment. Meaning was constructed close to home. This localization of meaning does not imply isolation. It learned how to manage uncertainty, distribute responsibility, and sustain continuity through habit rather than command. This learning did not produce monuments or manifestos. It produced a way of life durable enough to carry people forward until new forms of organization became possible. When those forms arrived, they did so on terms shaped by what had been learned in the long interval after Rome. Thus, Roman Britain's true conclusion lies not in disappearance, but in absorption. Its legacy was not preserved intact, nor was it rejected. It was translated into assumptions, practices, and expectations that no longer required reference to their origin. History often celebrates beginnings and endings because they are visible. The end of Roman Britain resists such framing. It is significant precisely because it cannot be easily marked. Its importance lies in duration, subtlety, and outcome rather than event, and in recognizing that we arrive at a fuller understanding of historical change. Not all transformations announce themselves. Some unfold slowly, carried by ordinary lives adjusting to altered conditions, until the past has been so thoroughly integrated that it no longer needs to be remembered. Roman Britain ended when it became unnecessary to remember it at all. At that point, history yields fully to habit. What had once required explanation now operates without comment, and what had once been contingent feels inevitable. This is the final stage of transformation, the moment when a society no longer recognizes itself as transformed at all. For Britain, this meant that the Roman centuries had become part of a deeper, quieter inheritance. Not an inheritance of laws or offices, but of orientation. The experience of living without empire had reshaped expectations so thoroughly that even when new structures appeared, they were interpreted through lenses formed in its absence. This inheritance shaped how people related to power. Authority was no longer assumed to be permanent or universal. It was provisional, negotiated, and subject to change. Even when larger political formations arose, they were filtered through local realities. Power that could not be seen, tested, or appealed to directly remained suspect. It also shaped how people related to one another. Social bonds carried weight because they had proven essential. Cooperation was not idealized, but practiced. Conflict was expected, but managed. The balance between self-interest and collective survival was understood not as a moral abstraction, but as lived necessity. In this world, memory functioned differently. The past was not a repository of instruction, but a reservoir of examples, stories of what had worked and what had failed. Rome, when it appeared in memory, was not a model to be restored, but a reminder of scale, ambition, and fragility. This altered relationship to the past influenced how people imagined the future. Rather than projecting grand designs, they planned within known limits. Adaptation, not permanence, became the measure of success. A good arrangement was one that could absorb disruption and still function. Such an outlook does not produce dramatic achievements, but it produces endurance. It favors continuity over spectacle, stability over expansion. In post-Roman Britain, this orientation allowed society to persist through centuries of uncertainty without dissolving. When later periods introduced new frameworks, political, religious, economic, they did not encounter a vacuum. They encountered a society already organized around practice, expectation, and restraint. These frameworks succeeded only insofar as they aligned with that underlying reality. This is why Roman Britain's end cannot be isolated as a discrete historical moment. Its consequences were cumulative and enduring. They shaped the conditions under which later history unfolded, even when Rome itself had faded beyond relevance. The Roman Empire once defined Britain's connection to a wider world. Its withdrawal forced a redefinition that was inward, local, and practical. That redefinition did not end when new connections formed. It remained embedded in how those connections were understood and managed. In the end, the most profound legacy of Roman Britain was not what it left behind, but what it taught through its absence. It taught that systems can disappear without ending society, that order can persist without design, and that meaning can be rebuilt without instruction. These lessons were not written down. They were lived. They were passed from generation to generation through behavior rather than text. They became part of the fabric of life. And so, the story closes not with a final transformation, but with normalization. The extraordinary circumstances of imperial withdrawal receded into ordinariness. Life continued, shaped by adaptations that no longer needed to be named. Roman Britain did not end in collapse or conquest. It ended in quiet success, the success of a society that learned how to go on. That quiet success is difficult to celebrate because it leaves little to point to. But it is among the most important outcomes history can offer. It reminds us that the endurance of human communities depends less on the permanence of their institutions than on their capacity to adapt when those institutions fall away. In that sense, the true conclusion of Roman Britain is not found in ruins or chronicles, but in continuity itself, a continuity forged through patience, adjustment, and the steady work of ordinary lives carrying the world forward after empire had moved on. Beyond that quiet success lies a final, almost paradoxical realization that the disappearance of Rome from Britain was complete only when it no longer felt like a disappearance at all. When absence ceased to be noticed, Rome had truly gone. What remained was not a post-imperial society, but simply a society, one that no longer defined itself in relation to what had been lost. At this point, historical causation becomes difficult to trace, because effects have outlived awareness of their causes. Practices endure without explanation. Attitudes persist without justification. The origins of assumptions are forgotten, even as those assumptions continue to shape behavior. This is history at its deepest level, where influence survives without memory. In Britain, the habits formed during centuries of adjustment became so thoroughly embedded that they shaped responses to challenges long after the Roman past had faded. When pressures arose, whether from climate, conflict, or new political ambitions, communities responded using patterns forged in the long absence of centralized authority. They negotiated, they adapted, they absorbed change incrementally rather than seeking total solutions. This incrementalism was not a conscious philosophy. It was an inheritance of experience. People had learned that sweeping solutions rarely endured, and that survival depended on responsiveness rather than rigidity. As a result, social change tended to be cumulative rather than abrupt, layered rather than uniform. The quiet durability of this approach is one reason why later historical developments in Britain often appear uneven or resistant to neat categorization. Institutions evolved slowly. Authority expanded cautiously. Custom and precedent carried weight alongside innovation. These characteristics were not accidental. They were the residue of a world shaped by long adaptation after empire. In this sense, Roman Britain's end did not simply prepare the ground for medieval society. It conditioned the manner in which medieval society would develop. The tempo of change, the skepticism toward centralized control, and the emphasis on local legitimacy all reflected lessons learned during the centuries when Rome was absent but not yet irrelevant. Even when political power later expanded in scale, it rarely erased these underlying patterns. New systems had to coexist with older expectations. Authority that ignored them struggled to take root. The past constrained the future not through memory, but through habit. This constraint illustrates a fundamental principle of historical continuity. The most enduring influences are often those that operate below consciousness. They shape what feels reasonable, possible, or acceptable. They guide decision-making without being articulated. They persist precisely because they are no longer questioned. Roman Britain's long aftermath thus represents not a failure to preserve civilization, but a success in translating it. Translation always involves loss, but it also enables survival. What could not be carried forward was left behind. What could be lived with was retained, reshaped, and normalized. From a distance, this process lacks drama. There are no turning points to commemorate, no decisive reforms to celebrate. But from within, it was life itself, ongoing, demanding, and sufficient. People lived, worked, argued, reconciled, and endured without needing to know that they were completing a historical transformation. This ordinariness is the final mark of success. When extraordinary change becomes ordinary life, adaptation has done its work. The world no longer needs to explain itself. It simply continues. Roman Britain ended not with an ending, but with this continuation. The empire withdrew, the framework dissolved, and society reassembled itself without instruction. What followed was not a lesser world, but a different one, smaller in scale, closer in relation, and grounded in experience rather than abstraction. In closing, the story offers a quiet but powerful insight into the nature of history. Civilizations are not sustained solely by the strength of their institutions, nor are they undone by the loss of them. They endure through the capacity of people to adjust their expectations, reorganize their lives, and normalize new realities. The end of Roman Britain reminds us that survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is patient, sometimes it is unrecorded, and sometimes it is so complete that it leaves behind not a memory of crisis, but a way of living that no longer needs to remember how it began. As the narrative settles into this final stillness, one last dimension deserves attention. Not because it alters the story, but because it completes it. That dimension is scale. Roman Britain's transformation demonstrates how profoundly scale shapes human experience, and how its reduction can be as consequential as its expansion. Under Roman rule, scale had been external. Decisions were made far away. Resources moved across vast distances. Authority flowed from centers that most people would never see. This scale created efficiency and coherence, but it also created distance between decision and consequence, between power and those subject to it. After Rome, scale collapsed inward. Life became smaller geographically and socially. This contraction did not simplify existence. It intensified it. Actions mattered more because their effects were immediate. Relationships mattered more because there were fewer alternatives. The reduced scale of society sharpened awareness of interdependence. This sharpening altered ethical life. Responsibility could not be deferred to institutions or officials. Moral judgment became situational, rooted in knowledge of people rather than rules. Right and wrong were negotiated within communities that would continue to exist after the dispute was resolved. This necessity encouraged restraint, compromise, and attention to consequence. Such ethics were not idealized. They were pragmatic. They arose not from theory, but from constraint. When communities cannot escape one another, they must find ways to coexist. Post-Roman Britain was shaped by this imperative. The Roman world had allowed individuals to imagine themselves as parts of something vast and enduring. The post-Roman world required people to imagine themselves as parts of something fragile and immediate. This shift changed how people valued time. The distant future mattered less than the coming season. Permanence gave way to maintenance. Maintenance, in this context, was not stagnation. It was active work. Fields had to be tended. Relationships had to be renewed. Authority had to be reaffirmed. Stability required effort precisely because it was not guaranteed. Over generations, this effort produced a culture attuned to upkeep rather than expansion. Success was measured by continuity, by the ability to pass land, knowledge, and social bonds from one generation to the next without catastrophic rupture. This was a modest ambition, but it was sufficient. When later historical forces reintroduced larger scales of organization, they did so into a society already shaped by these priorities. Expansion was possible, but it was filtered through habits of caution and negotiation. Authority could grow, but it was expected to justify itself in practice. This layered inheritance explains why Britain's later history often displays tension between centralization and locality. Neither impulse fully overcame the other. Both were grounded in lived experience. Rome had shown what scale could achieve. Post-Roman life had shown what life without it required. The end of Roman Britain, then, was not simply a withdrawal of power. It was a recalibration of human scale. People learned how large a world they could manage and how much complexity they could sustain without external support. Those lessons endured. In the final analysis, Roman Britain's story is not one of disappearance, but of redistribution of authority, responsibility, memory, and meaning. Empire concentrated these elements. Its absence dispersed them. What emerged was not disorder, but a different configuration of order. This configuration lacked the grandeur of empire, but it possessed resilience. It was not designed to impress or endure unchanged. It was designed implicitly, unconsciously, to function under uncertainty. And that, ultimately, is the quiet achievement of post-Roman Britain. It did not preserve Rome, nor did it collapse without it. It learned how to live at a different scale, with different expectations, and with a deeper awareness of impermanence. History often celebrates builders of empires and founders of systems. Less often does it attend to those who adapt after systems fade. Yet it is adaptation that determines whether societies persist. Roman Britain persisted not as an empire, not as a province, but as a lived world reshaped by necessity. Its end was not marked by fire or proclamation, but by normalization. The extraordinary became ordinary. The past became background. Life went on. And in that continuation lies the truest conclusion of the story, that the most enduring transformations are those that leave no monument, no final chapter, and no clear moment of completion. Only a world quietly changed, and people living within it as if it had always been so. What remains, then, is to recognize that this quiet change did not diminish the human experience. It reoriented it. In the absence of empire, meaning was no longer derived from belonging to something vast and abstract. It was drawn instead from proximity, repetition, and survival. The world became smaller, but it also became more legible. People understood their place within it not through law or decree, but through familiarity. This familiarity shaped how risk was perceived. Under Roman administration, danger often arrived from afar, through imperial conflict, taxation demands, or decisions made elsewhere. After Rome, danger was local and visible. The sources were known. This did not make life safer, but it made threat intelligible. People learned to respond rather than speculate. Responsiveness replaced prediction. Instead of planning for distant futures shaped by unknown forces, communities focused on managing what they could see. This shift encouraged attentiveness to environment, to social signals, and to change in its earliest forms. Adaptation became continuous rather than episodic. Such attentiveness fostered a different relationship with knowledge. Information was valued when it was actionable. Stories, advice, and memory circulated not for their completeness, but for their usefulness. Knowledge that could not guide action faded. What remained was practical wisdom, refined through repetition. This refinement occurred slowly. There was no single moment of mastery. Skills were learned, forgotten, and relearned across generations. Continuity depended not on perfection, but on redundancy, the repetition of practices until they became habit. Habit, in turn, became stability. The Roman world had depended heavily on specialization. After its withdrawal, specialization narrowed. Individuals and households assumed broader roles. This diversification reduced efficiency but increased resilience. Fewer tasks depended on single points of failure. Survival became distributed. This distribution of responsibility had social consequences. It blurred distinctions between roles that had once been formalized. Authority overlapped with labor. Leadership was expected to be visible in action, not distant in command. The separation between governing and living narrowed. As a result, political identity became less distinct from social identity. Leaders were known personally. Their decisions were experienced directly. This intimacy limited abstraction. Governance was something people encountered daily, not something they imagined remotely. Over time, this intimacy reshaped expectations of justice and fairness. Outcomes mattered more than process. People cared less about whether rules were followed than whether resolution was achieved. This emphasis did not eliminate norms, but it made them flexible. Norms served relationships, not the other way around. The Roman legal tradition, once dominant, thus gave way not to lawlessness, but to negotiated order. Agreements were enforced through reputation and consequence rather than codification. This form of order was less predictable but more responsive. The cumulative effect of these changes was a society that functioned without needing to name its principles. Its values were enacted rather than declared. They were embedded in practice, transmitted through participation, and adjusted as needed. When viewed from a distance, such a society can appear opaque or undeveloped. It leaves few records, produces little monumental evidence. Yet its effectiveness is measured not in preservation of form, but in continuity of life. Roman Britain's end, therefore, challenges the metrics by which historical success is often judged. It did not sustain imperial complexity, but it sustained people. It did not preserve institutions, but it preserved social function. It did not record itself, but it endured. In this endurance lies its significance. The centuries after Rome demonstrate that human societies can survive profound systemic loss without descending into chaos or requiring immediate replacement. They can reorganize themselves through habit, negotiation, and repetition. This capacity is rarely acknowledged because it does not announce itself. It leaves no dramatic turning points. It unfolds gradually, carried by everyday decisions that seem insignificant in isolation. Yet over time, these decisions accumulate into transformation. The end of Roman Britain was such a transformation. It unfolded beneath awareness, reshaping society not through instruction, but through necessity. It produced a world that no longer required Rome to function, even as it carried traces of Rome forward unconsciously. And so, the story does not end with closure, but with continuity. There is no final lesson to be declared, only an understanding to be absorbed. History does not always move through rupture. Sometimes it moves through adjustment so complete that it becomes invisible. Roman Britain faded not because it failed, but because life learned how to proceed without it. That learning, quiet and unrecorded, was its true legacy. And in recognizing that legacy, we see that history is not only the record of what was built and lost, but of what was learned and lived, patiently, collectively, and without knowing that it would one day be called history at all. As that understanding settles, it becomes clear that the disappearance of Roman Britain was not an erasure, but a deep recalibration of how meaning itself was produced. Meaning no longer flowed from imperial narratives, legal codes, or distant authority. It emerged instead from repetition: what worked yesterday, what worked last season, what had worked for one's parents and neighbors. This reliance on repetition did not freeze society in place. Repetition was not rigidity, it was testing. Practices endured because they were continually proven under changing conditions. When they failed, they were modified or abandoned. In this way, post-Roman Britain remained dynamic without being expansive, adaptive without being ambitious. The absence of empire also altered how people understood responsibility across time. Under Roman administration, continuity was imagined as something guaranteed, protected by institutions meant to outlast individuals. After Rome, continuity depended on transmission. Knowledge, land use, and social norms had to be actively passed on. Forgetting became dangerous. Memory became functional. This made intergenerational relationships especially significant. Elders were valued not as symbols of authority, but as repositories of tested experience. Children learned not through abstract instruction, but through participation in tasks whose outcomes mattered. Learning was inseparable from living. Such a society placed limits on abstraction. Ideas that could not be enacted held little value. Authority that could not be seen held little legitimacy. Explanations that could not guide action faded quickly. This practical orientation narrowed the range of acceptable belief, but it deepened reliability. Over time, this reliability shaped expectations of leadership. Leaders were not visionaries in the modern sense. They were managers of continuity. Their success was measured not by transformation, but by the absence of breakdown. Stability was the highest achievement, precisely because it was fragile. This fragility fostered humility toward power. Ambition carried risk. Overextension threatened collapse. Communities learned to expand cautiously, if at all. Growth was secondary to survival. This restraint did not eliminate aspiration, but it tempered it. The Roman past, when invoked, served mainly as contrast. It represented a world of scale and certainty that no longer matched experience. Its ruins were impressive, but they belonged to a different logic. The society that followed Rome did not reject that logic. It simply could not sustain it. In this sense, Roman Britain did not fail to continue Rome. It succeeded in adapting to conditions where Rome could not function. That adaptation required sacrifice of comfort, of connectivity, of predictability, but it preserved life. The success of this preservation is easy to overlook because it lacks visible markers. It did not produce a new ideology or a coherent system. It produced normalcy. Fields were cultivated. Families persisted. Disputes were resolved. Time passed. History often privileges moments when power announces itself. Foundations, conquests, reforms. The end of Roman Britain offers a counterexample. It shows how power can dissolve without catastrophe, and how society can reorganize without declaration. This reorganization did not aspire to completeness. It was never finished. It remained open-ended, responsive to circumstance. That openness became its defining strength. It allowed society to absorb shocks without shattering. When later centuries introduced new pressures and new forms of authority, they encountered a population accustomed to negotiation rather than obedience, to adaptation rather than permanence. These habits shaped the reception of change. Thus, the end of Roman Britain was not merely a historical outcome. It was a training ground. It trained society in living without guarantees, in sustaining order through practice rather than command, and in finding meaning close at hand rather than in distant systems. The training was not intentional. It was imposed by circumstance, but its effects were lasting. In the long view, this period teaches that history's most durable lessons are often learned under constraint. They are learned not because they are chosen, but because they are required. Once learned, they become invisible. Roman Britain's disappearance was completed when its absence no longer demanded explanation. At that point, society had fully internalized a new way of being. The empire had ceased to matter, not because it was forgotten, but because it was no longer needed. And so, history moved on, not with a clean break, but with a quiet continuation shaped by everything that had been endured. If you wish, I can now bring this to a definitive closing paragraph suitable for the final minutes of a multi-hour documentary, or pause here exactly, preserving this as the ending tone. In that continuation, the story reaches its most subtle conclusion, not a conclusion of events, but of orientation. By the time Roman Britain had fully dissolved into ordinary life, society was no longer looking backward or forward in any conscious sense. It was simply inhabiting the present, guided by practices that had proven sufficient. This sufficiency is easy to underestimate. It does not promise improvement or security beyond the next cycle. It promises only that life can continue. Yet that promise, repeatedly fulfilled, becomes its own form of stability. People stop waiting for restoration or replacement. They invest instead in maintenance. Maintenance became the defining labor of post-Roman Britain. Not maintenance of monuments or institutions, but of relationships, land, and knowledge. The work was continuous and uncelebrated. It required attention rather than vision, care rather than command. And it worked. Over generations, this labor shaped character. Patience replaced expectation. Prudence replaced optimism. Cooperation replaced coordination. These traits were not consciously cultivated. They emerged as byproducts of necessity. They were reinforced each time disruption was met with adjustment rather than collapse. The Roman Empire had once offered Britain a sense of belonging to something vast and ordered. Its withdrawal removed that sense, but it also removed the illusion that order was guaranteed. What replaced it was not despair, but realism. People learned what could be controlled and what could not. This realism reshaped emotional life. Fear became localized rather than abstract. Hope became immediate rather than distant. The future was not imagined as progress, but as continuity. This orientation did not eliminate suffering, but it gave suffering a context within which it could be endured. In this world, success was not measured by expansion or legacy, but by survival with dignity. To keep land productive, relationships intact, and violence contained was achievement enough. Anything beyond that was uncertain and secondary. Such a definition of success rarely enters historical narrative because it resists drama. Yet it is precisely this quiet definition that allowed society to persist through centuries of uncertainty. It is the reason there was something for later histories to build upon. The end of Roman Britain, then, is best understood not as a fall from complexity, but as a shift in what complexity meant. Complexity moved from centralized systems to lived relationships, from written codes to shared expectations, from visible authority to negotiated order. This shift did not reduce human capability. It redistributed it. Responsibility moved closer to the individual and the community. Power became more accountable because it was more visible. Order became more fragile because it depended on cooperation rather than command. Fragility, however, is not weakness. It is a condition that demands care. Post-Roman Britain survived because care became habitual. People learned to tend what remained rather than lament what was lost. When the Roman past finally receded beyond relevance, it left behind not a void, but a society shaped by the long practice of adaptation. That society was not waiting for empire to return. It was not seeking to recreate what had been. It was living within the limits it understood. And in that understanding lies the quiet ending of the story. Roman Britain did not vanish into darkness or chaos. It transitioned into a form of life that no longer required the empire that had once sustained it. The empire withdrew. Life adjusted. Meaning relocated. History continued. There is no final scene to describe, no decisive moment to mark. Only the steady presence of people living in a world that had changed and no longer needed to remember why. That is how Roman Britain ended, not with a final act, but with the normalization of change, carried forward by ordinary lives until the extraordinary circumstances that shaped them faded into the background of time itself. And with that normalization, the last trace of rupture finally disappears. What had once been an adjustment to loss becomes simply the way things are done. The past no longer presses for acknowledgement, and the future no longer promises restoration. Life exists in a steady present, shaped by limits that feel natural rather than imposed. This is the point at which historical transformation becomes irreversible. Not because alternatives are impossible, but because they are no longer imagined. Rome does not return, not because it cannot, but because it no longer answers any meaningful question. The problems people face are local, immediate, and practical, and the solutions they trust are those that arise from within their own experience. In such a world, continuity is maintained not through conscious effort to preserve tradition, but through the quiet repetition of what works. Customs survive because they solve problems. Relationships endure because they provide support. Authority persists only when it remains responsive. Everything else falls away without resistance. The absence of resistance is telling. Suggests not resignation, but acceptance. Acceptance that the world has limits. Acceptance that stability must be tended rather than assumed. Acceptance that life does not require grand structures in order to continue meaningfully. This acceptance reshapes how people think about loss. Loss is no longer understood as a break from a rightful order, but as a condition to be managed. The Roman Empire becomes, at most, an example of something that existed once and then did not. Its disappearance does not demand explanation or mourning. It is simply part of how the world behaves. Such an outlook fosters resilience without optimism. It does not expect improvement, but it does not fear change. It prepares for disruption without being defined by it. This balance between vigilance and normalcy is one of the quiet achievements of post-Roman society. Over time, this balance becomes invisible because it works. Crises occur, but they are absorbed. Power shifts, but life continues. New influences arrive, but they are evaluated, adapted, or resisted according to local judgment. Nothing is absolute. Everything is provisional. This provisionality does not weaken society. It keeps it flexible. It prevents overcommitment to forms that may not endure. It allows people to respond to change without abandoning continuity. In this sense, impermanence becomes a stabilizing force. The Roman world had attempted to overcome impermanence through scale and system. Its withdrawal demonstrated the limits of that approach. What followed was not a rejection of order, but a redefinition of it, one grounded in care rather than control. Care is not often recognized as a historical force, yet here it is central. Care for land, care for kin, care for reputation, care for balance. These forms of care sustained society when structures failed. They required no ideology, only attention. Attention, repeated across generations, became culture. A culture of watching, adjusting, maintaining. A culture that did not seek to conquer uncertainty, but to live within it. This culture did not announce itself. It simply persisted, and persistence, in the end, is the quiet measure of success. Roman Britain did not need to be remembered in order to matter. Its significance lay in what it made possible. A society capable of surviving without guarantees, capable of reorganizing without instruction, capable of carrying on without knowing that it was doing something historically extraordinary. The story therefore concludes not with closure, but with continuity so complete that it no longer appears as continuity at all. Life moves forward without reference to what came before. The past dissolves into the background, shaping the present without being named. This is how large historical transitions truly end. Not when the last institution falls, but when the absence of that institution no longer shapes expectation. When people stop waiting for return, stop fearing collapse, and stop explaining their world through what is gone. Roman Britain reached that point slowly, quietly, and without record. And when it did, the transition was complete. What remained was not Rome, not its shadow and not its memory, but a living society shaped by experience, grounded in practice, and capable of continuing on its own terms. That is where the story finally rests. Not in endings or beginnings, but in endurance itself. What endures beyond that point is not a narrative that can be neatly summarized, but a condition that resists summary. The transformation of Roman Britain ultimately leaves us with a society that no longer defines itself through change at all. Change has become background. It is no longer a force to be named, but a fact to be lived with. In such a condition, people do not experience history as movement from one state to another. They experience it as weather, sometimes harsh, sometimes favorable, always present. Adaptation becomes instinctive rather than deliberate. The skills required to live within uncertainty are learned so early and practiced so often that they cease to feel like skills at all. This is perhaps the final and most complete stage of historical adjustment, when survival strategies become culture and culture becomes habit. At that point, the origin of those habits no longer matters. They are not preserved because they are old, nor because they are valued in the abstract, but because they remain useful. Roman Britain's disappearance fits precisely into this pattern. The empire did not need to be remembered in order to shape what followed. Its withdrawal set conditions that demanded response, and those responses, tested, refined, and repeated, became the fabric of life. Once that fabric was strong enough to hold, the memory of why it had been woven could fade. This fading should not be mistaken for loss of identity. On the contrary, it marks the consolidation of a new one. Identity no longer relied on imperial affiliation or inherited status. It rested on participation in a shared way of living. Belonging was defined by contribution and recognition, not by inscription or decree. Such an identity was resilient precisely because it was unarticulated. It could not be easily challenged because it was not based on claims that could be disproven. It was enacted daily, reinforced by routine, and transmitted through example. It existed wherever people lived according to shared expectations. The Roman world had relied on articulation, laws, edicts, titles, boundaries. The world that followed relied on enactment. What mattered was not what was said, but what was done. This shift altered how authority was perceived. Words alone carried little weight. Action was required. This emphasis on action further narrowed the distance between power and responsibility. Leaders could not govern through symbols alone. They had to demonstrate capacity repeatedly. Authority that failed to perform lost credibility quickly, and there were few institutional buffers to protect it. Such conditions did not produce equality, but they did produce accountability. Power was constrained not by law, but by proximity. Those who exercised it could not escape the consequences of their decisions. This proximity shaped behavior in ways that formal systems often cannot. As centuries passed, these constraints continued to shape social evolution. Even when writing returned, Even when larger political units formed, even when new hierarchies emerged, the underlying expectation remained: authority must work. It must align with lived reality. It must justify itself in practice. This expectation, forged in the long aftermath of Roman withdrawal, became one of the most enduring legacies of the period. It was not a doctrine, but a disposition. It shaped how people responded to power long after Rome had faded beyond recognition. In this way, the end of Roman Britain did not mark the disappearance of order, but the emergence of a different understanding of it. Order was no longer something imposed from above. It was something maintained from within. It required participation rather than compliance. Participation, however, carries cost. It demands attention, effort, and responsibility. Life after empire was not easier. It was more demanding, but it was also more direct. People lived closer to the consequences of their actions, and that closeness shaped judgment. Over time, this judgment became refined. Communities learned how far they could stretch resources, how much conflict they could absorb, how much change they could tolerate. These limits were not fixed, but they were understood. They formed an invisible framework guiding decision-making. This invisible framework is what ultimately replaced Rome. Not a new empire, not a new system, but a shared sense of what was possible and what was not. Once that sense stabilized, society no longer needed to refer to what had been lost. History at that point did not stop. It simply moved on to other questions. The Roman past remained embedded in landscape and habit, but it no longer structured imagination. Britain was no longer living after Rome. It was living, and that, finally, is where the story becomes complete. Not because everything has been resolved, but because nothing remains unresolved in a way that demands attention. The empire's absence has been fully absorbed. The world functions on its own terms. Roman Britain ends not with a final transformation, but with a settled condition. A society that has learned how to continue without asking for what once sustained it. As the documentary approaches its final moments, it becomes clear that nothing more dramatic needs to be said. The story of Roman Britain does not conclude with revelation, but with recognition. Recognition that history does not always move through events that can be dated or named. Recognition that some of the most consequential changes occur without witnesses who understand what they are living through. Recognition that societies are not sustained by memory alone, but by the quiet competence of adaptation. By the time Roman Britain had fully passed from relevance, no one was left to notice its absence. People no longer measured their world against imperial standards or waited for the return of distant authority. They lived within limits they understood, using practices they trusted, in landscapes shaped by layers of inheritance they no longer questioned. This was not amnesia, it was resolution. The empire had done its work. Its withdrawal had done its work as well. Together, they produced a society that no longer required either explanation or justification. Life had stabilized on new terms. What remains for us, looking back across centuries, is not a sense of loss, but of continuity achieved without instruction. Fields remained worked. Communities endured. Authority existed, but it was grounded in presence rather than distance. Order survived not because it was imposed, but because it was practiced. The Roman roads still guided movement, even as their builders were forgotten. The old walls still shaped boundaries, even as their purpose changed. The past persisted not as memory, but as environment. This is how history often works. Its most durable effects are those that disappear into normality. Roman Britain did not leave behind a final message, a warning, or a blueprint. It left behind a demonstration that societies can survive the withdrawal of large systems, that meaning can be rebuilt without instruction, that continuity does not require permanence of form. In the end, Roman Britain did not fall. It did not collapse into darkness. It did not await rescue, faded into life, and in that fading, unmarked, uncelebrated, and almost entirely unrecorded, it completed one of the most important transitions in Britain's history, not from civilization to chaos, but from empire to endurance. This is where the story rests, not at a moment, not at a date, but at a condition. A world no longer defined by what it had lost, but by how it lived with what remained. History continues beyond this point, as it always does. But the long silence after Rome tells us something essential, that when great structures withdraw, what matters most is not what disappears, but what quietly carries on. And it is there, in the patient, ordinary continuation of life, that the true ending of Roman Britain can finally be found.